Amanda, you all set? Let me call to order the Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency meeting for Wednesday, September 28th. If you all rise for a pledge of allegiance. We provide Saragossa. If you'd lead us, please.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right. Amanda, roll call.
Chair Mulhart?
Here.
Director Craven?
Here.
Director Zaragoza?
Here.
Director Kelly?
Here.
Director Borchard?
Here.
Okay. Sam McIntyre is in the audience. Dave Schwabauer is in the audience. There's Dan Nauman in the audience. I don't see any other alternates, so let it reflect the three alternates are here. The fourth alternate is actually here. Alternating, yeah.
And Mr. Chair, just for information, I'm going to have to leave at 3:45 today.
Okay, and I thank you for saying that. Charlotte's got to leave at 4. You have to leave at 3:45. Staff's got a big agenda for us today, and my understanding is Dr. Stiles, who's going to talk about irrigation indexing, won't be here until 3. 3 or 3:30. So we're going to try to get as much as we can done before then, and then we'll race our way through it.
Okay.
And
We need to let him make a presentation, not race him.
yes, I understand that. Okay. Any changes on the agenda?
None, other than we'd request that you postpone item 8 until Dr. Stiles gets here.
Okay, we just talked about that. All right. Public comments. Anybody have any items for the GMA board they want to talk about that's not on the agenda? Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, Chairman and Directors and staff. I'm Steve Nash. I'm a resident of Oxnard. And a couple of items from the last meeting. Chairman Mulhart called the City of Oxnard's credits good credits. Is this a third category in addition to storage and conservation credits? The City of Oxnard is currently pumping its 30,000 acre-feet of conservation credits to supplement its municipal needs with complete depletion of its banked credits projected by 2014. By allowing this, how are you fulfilling your mission statement? The fact that this agency is still debating the necessity of AMRs 29 years after its formation is, in my opinion, ludicrous. As a citizen who has no say whatsoever whether my utility compensation is recorded, I find the concept of self-reporting naive and quaint. The fact that there is unanimity of opposition to AMRs among the LPUG suggests that it is a good idea to go ahead and implement this program. From item 4A, page 26, both the August 10th, 2011 LPUG meeting and the August 24th, 2011 LPUG meeting, I was unclear exactly if this was publicly noticed, but excuse me if I mispronounced this, Mr. Gromlich noted that the users group meeting had been noticed as a special meeting of the GMA in case there appeared to be a quorum of board members, and I just want to make sure that there was no violation of the Brown Act, and I think that concludes my statements. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All righty. Anybody else have any comments? Not on the agenda? Okay, we have board member comments. Anybody? All right, we have some consent items. Item number 1, 2, and 3. A motion to approve and a second. Any discussion? Okay, all in favor? Aye. Opposed? Hearing none. Okay, let's go to informational item number 4.
Afternoon, Chair Mulhart and Directors. Brian Bondi, United, GMA, and Cayugas, presenting item 4. I do have slides for this staff report. There they are. Great. A large amount of work's been done on the basin plan this year, particularly since we last met in July. Since July, I've put together a complete preliminary draft of the basin-specific plan for the Las Posas basins, with the help of Dr. Bachman and Henry Gromlich. Susan Mulligan's helped with review, and I'd also like to acknowledge Jeff Dorrington of the Watershed Protection District. He was a great help in putting together the figures. The users group has been meeting twice per month to review the plan as we've assembled it over the last 2.5 months. All of the meeting documentation that you're used to seeing with this item is included as items 4A and 4B. I'm not going to go through those in details. Rather, what I'd like to do, and as discussed in my staff report, is get on to a presentation giving an overview of the basin plan and request your feedback on a number of issues. Some of the material I'll cover today will be review for some of you, and some of it will be new for others. Given the large amount of good work that's been completed to date, this presentation discussion will likely be very lengthy, probably on the order of an hour. I'm sensitive to the fact that we have a full agenda today, and I believe there's several pumpers that also would like to speak, so I'll try and move through as quickly as possible. Go ahead and ask questions as we go along. Just by way of overview, by the end of the presentation, I hope to have the board understanding the basic hydrogeology of the basin, the key groundwater management issues, and an overview of our solutions. We don't have time to go through everything in full detail. We have more meetings to do that. We'll start by discussing the pumper's goals and objectives for this plan. We're also going to need to discuss how the board would like to deal with adopting a set of interim measures to bridge the gap between adoption of our basin plan and implementation of some of the key strategies. We'll do this at the end. The interim measures will make more sense as we go through the presentation. As indicated in my staff report, there's a number of items we're requesting feedback on. Those items are in bold italics. We'll start with the goals and objectives. I'm going to go through these first before I describe the management issues. I think this will help us understand why the group has made some of the decisions they've made. We originally developed these, the pumpers really developed these. This was their work. The goals and objectives set the guiding principles for the basin plan, the decisions we've made, and hopefully future groundwater management decisions moving forward. We completed these in February of this year, and we presented them to the board in March. At the time in March, we were still very early in the planning process, so we didn't really seek your feedback, but we're asking for that feedback today. We'd like to confirm that the board is in agreement with the overall principles guiding this plan. All you really need to know to understand the goals and objectives is that overall there's currently enough water in the basin. It's just not in the right places, and we have some salt management issues in one part of the basin for some users. Specifically, the west part of the basin has good quality water, just not enough of it. In the east part of the basin, there's plenty of water, but there's too much salt. And there's going to be a cost associated with managing those salts, and that's key to this plan. In the nutshell, the plan's about 4 things: fixing the water distribution problem, managing water quality and improving it over the long term, and increasing our overall supply so that we can continue to meet demands in the future. Lastly, the plan needs to accommodate operation of Cayugas Municipal Water District's aquifer and storage recovery in the eastern part of the basin. Those are the 4 main things we're trying to accomplish. These goals and objectives will take on a deeper meaning as we go through the management issues and describe the strategies. At this point, one opportunity to streamline this discussion would be to ask the board if you've had a chance to review the goals and objectives in item 4C. If you have, I can abstain from doing a detailed discussion of those, so I defer to whatever your pleasure is.
What is your pleasure? Okay. Just a quick overview.
Okay.
It'll help for the audience, those that have not been to the meetings as well.
Okay, very well.
And those watching, yeah.
There are 2 goals. The goals are broad. We've also identified a number of specific objectives that provide more concrete definition of each goal. The first goal is to maintain a reliable groundwater supply of a quality suitable to the needs of the pumpers by implementing the most cost-effective and equitable institutional and physical solutions. It's kind of a lot in there, but it's actually fairly straightforward. Basically, the pumpers just want to make sure that the actions they take will ensure they have enough water of the right quality to meet their needs, and they want to control costs as best as they can and share those costs in a fair way. There's 7 objectives that go along with this. One is in order to achieve this goal, we need to understand the basin. So we need to document the basin conditions, both current and what we expect in the future. The plan does this. The plan needs to identify the things we don't know and have approaches to filling those data gaps. The plan does this. In fact, we're already taking actions to address some of the key data gaps, and I'll point those out a little bit later. Third objective, this is really at the heart of sustainability, operate the sub-basins within the operational yield of the basin, and that means we're pumping no more than the supply of water coming in to keep water levels stable and manage water quality. Fourth objective, limit saline intrusion, and this applies to the eastern part of the basin where we have poor quality water entering our deep aquifers. We want to limit that intrusion to the extent possible, and in cases where we can't limit it, we need to provide means for folks to manage their water quality. And when I say manage water quality, I primarily mean blending. The fifth objective is they want to develop projects that collectively achieve sustainability. And one difference of this basin with the rest of the GMA is we don't have United in the Las Posas Basin. So there's no entity that can collect a fee and build projects on behalf of others. The group did discuss the concept of creating a water replenishment district or something like a United for that purpose. The consensus was to not do that, not add another layer of government. Folks want the flexibility to build their own projects. The idea of the plan is to make sure those projects integrate in a way that keeps the basin in balance and deals with the issues. Monitor, assess our performance, and manage adaptively. We're going to have basin management objectives in this plan. Those are quantitative metrics for water levels and water quality. Those are what we're going to use to evaluate the effectiveness of our strategies. If we need to adapt, our conditions relative to our BMOs will tell us that. Equitable distribution of burdens and addressing increasing water demand. Really two objectives here in one. Basically, fair share of costs, and we want to make sure that our strategies are designed to increase the basin yield as demand increases in the future. Second goal, maintain local control over groundwater management decisions to the maximum extent possible and facilitate local cooperation. And this really gets at the heart of the local solutions. First objective, obviously develop a pumper-driven groundwater management approach. That's the plan. The goal is to avoid adjudication. I believe there's fairly unanimous consensus on that. Develop equitable, cost-effective rules and projects. This is, again, a little bit of overlap with some of the other objectives. The GMA is going to administer the rules. The pumpers are going to develop and implement the projects. We want to have a local advisory committee to review groundwater conditions and make recommendations to the board. This is the Las Posas Users Group. Maximize effectiveness of the management strategies through local cooperation. Again, this is going to be primarily through the process of LPUG meeting and working within the framework of the plan to make sure collectively all the projects address the concerns. Monitor and assess plant performance and communicate the status to local pumpers. This is sort of redundant to one of the other objectives, but the key thing here is that communication is critical, and communicating performance and other status to the local pumpers is going to help keep the community together and making things moving in the right direction. So I'll pause here for a moment for board feedback on these goals and objectives.
Yeah, go ahead.
Number 3, who's in the local advisory, or this is a proposed?
We have an existing group called the Las Posas Users Group. It's a group of pumpers from the basin that meet on a regular basis. It's
Stakeholders.
It's a stakeholder group. It's open. It's public. That group is going to be this advisory group. The questions that are on the table is how formal is that group going to be in terms of its relationship with the GMA moving forward as we implement the plan. That's something that...
Brown Act committee or just an ad hoc committee?
This is ad hoc advisory.
Advisory.
In its current form.
Okay, anybody in the audience have any questions? Okay, Brian, continue.
Okay.
Oh, you wanted feedback on the first two? Let's back up. The question then before the board is, are we comfortable with the goals and objectives as spelled out in the initial draft of the plan? Dave?
Yes, the group's done a great job of teasing all this out and getting a succinct list of objectives based with these goals, and I think we should encourage them to go on their way and keep going.
Okay. Mike, anything?
A lot of work has been put into this, and I think that we should all be pleased with Brian's work of getting it assembled and keeping everybody from throwing rocks at each other.
Yeah, I will, or buckets of water, if necessary.
I prefer buckets of water over rocks.
Yeah, but it depends on how much, because we could charge you, so be careful. Yeah. I am very pleased with goals 1 and 2. I think the goals are correct for what you've been tasked to do, and in the meetings that I've been able to attend, I think you've made tremendous progress. I like the objectives. They're reasonable, they're fair, I think they're achievable, and I think they work within the context of the plan that you're putting together. So unless I'm hearing objectives, the board... That's the blue light special.
Is that an omen?
Yeah. Somebody just short-circuited the ad. So, anyway, based on the feedback of the board, I think you guys have a go with the goals and objectives as outlined.
Thank you.
Okay.
So let's talk a little bit about how the basins, what are our management areas, how do the basins work, and that'll lead into what the issues are and what the solutions are. This is a map of the area we're talking about. The Las Posas basins are shown in blue. The GMA management area, or GMA boundary, is shown in red. And the black line is our management area, and I'll explain how that came to be. Historically, this valley's been divided into 3 subbasins: west, east, and south. And these are based on geologic criteria. Really the important thing going on here is there's a fault running through the middle part of the Las Posas Valley that restricts flow in the main aquifers that people pump from. This area is essentially hydraulically isolated from this area. That's a key concept and a key thing in how we it relates to the issues, why the issues are different in this basin versus this subbasin. Under current conditions, the east and south basins really function together. There had been hypothesized that there was a structure here that limits flow, and that may be the case at lower water levels, but we're not seeing that now. So we're really treating this area, even though it's 2 subbasins, we're really treating that as one area. One key difference between the eastern area and the western area is that the eastern area has a shallow alluvial aquifer. This is sediment that's been laid down by the stream system here. This aquifer is probably no more than 200 feet thick at most. It's shallow. It's in communication with the stream, and this is a key feature in the basin, and we'll talk more about that. This aquifer, the shallow aquifer, is full. It has poor quality water and storage, but it also is a conduit for recharge to the deeper aquifers where most of the pumping's coming from. We plan to use the shallow aquifer as a source of supplemental water for the entire area, perhaps, but we'll also need to be careful that we don't, as we develop that, we don't cut off too much recharge to the deeper aquifers. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But just for now, just remember that the shallow aquifer is key to our overall management. The management area, the black line, this is the area that the plan addresses. The reason it's different from the basins is because the GMA has stated authority over the expansion area, which is an area between the agency boundary and the watershed boundary. The concern there is that water moves downhill, can move over areas where the deep aquifers are exposed along the edge of the mountain, and we could have water quality issues. So the management area incorporates the GMA's expansion area all along this area. Everywhere else, the management area is either following the GMA boundary or it's following a basin boundary, as it is here, and a reinterpreted basin boundary here. We have 3 sub-areas for management. Eastern management sub-area on this side of the fault, western management sub-area over here, and this portion of the West Las Posas Basin that's crosshatched is not being actively managed under the plan. This geographic area lies within United Water Conservation's district. The pumpers in that area made the case that they're already paying for groundwater management to United. They didn't want to be in a position to have to pay for two sets of solutions for one problem.
Brian, so that fault is, there's no connection between the two aquifers there? Is that
Not in,
too deep or too...
Not in the deep zones where most of the pumping's coming from. Possibly in some of the more shallow units that aren't.
We could have some interaction with it?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm going to show some cross sections now to give you a better idea of what this looks like. Two of them, one running north-south through the eastern area, one running along the arroyo here and into the western area. The first one is the north-south cross section, and this shows you the deep aquifers that I was referring to, the Fox Canyon in yellow, the Grimes in orange. Again, this is where the vast majority of the pumping in both parts of the basin are coming from. In the eastern area, here's the shallow aquifer, relatively thin, sitting at land surface in connection with the arroyo. And there's also some other aquifers that have fairly limited usage and are very localized in their area. Really the notable one is the Epworth Gravels. There's probably half a dozen or so pumpers in that area using about 1,000 acre-feet per year in aggregate. This aquifer is in balance, and so we're not addressing or proposing new management strategies for that aquifer. The plan will monitor it and will address issues as they arise in the future. So our focus is on managing the deep aquifers where most of the pumping is coming from and making use of the shallow aquifer as a source of supplemental supply. In the West Basin, in the East Las Posas Basin, the boundary between the two sub-areas is this fault here. So the fault on the map 2 slides ago is shown here. The aquifers are subject to folding and faulting, as you can see the faults in here, and they're also tilted upwards. In part of the East Las Posas, South Las Posas area, the Fox Canyon comes up to a shallow depth, and it's in this area where the shallow aquifer is probably leaking water downwards into the Fox and recharging it. So that shows you sort of the geologic nexus for why the shallow aquifer is both important in terms of its own storage, but also as a conduit to moving water into the deeper zone where most of the pumping is coming from. It's the head, the pressure in here that needs to be maintained to keep flow into there. So it's kind of how that works. So what are the groundwater management issues? The western management area, we're going to talk about a pumping depression. The eastern management sub-area, we're going to talk about the water quality, need for water quality management and improvement. Both areas, over the long term, we need to increase the yield of the basin to meet growing demand. That applies everywhere. And lastly, we need to accommodate ASR operations by Cayugas in the eastern area. We'll go through those. We'll start with the west. Again, we're talking about the western management sub-area. That's this portion of the basin west of the fault. This is the Somas area to give you some geographic context. In the western half of the west area, water levels have gone up and down, but overall they've stayed stable. They've gone down in drier periods, but they've come back up in wet periods. And overall, this part of the basin is pretty much in balance. Really, the issue is over in the southeastern corner of the basin up against the fault. This is where we've seen a long history of pervasive water level declines. This is starting in 1950. We're looking at upwards of over 300 feet of water level decline. We had a brief period where water levels rose. We understand why this happened. This was the result of a reduction in pumping, primarily by the Waterworks District 19, in where they took imported water in lieu of pumping for a number of years. So we have a pretty good handle on what it takes to solve this pervasive decline in water levels in terms of how much water needs to be brought into that area to offset pumping. Just geographically, this is sort of the area of concern when I talk about the pumping depression. Again, it's in the southeast corner up against the fault. The red dots show the pumping here, and the arrows are showing the direction of flow. And you can see there's quite a concentration of of larger red dots, that's just showing the pumping that's causing that issue. So what does this look like over time? Again, we were having pervasive declines, and we had the in-lieu deliveries, which raised water levels. Here's where we are now. Water levels are starting to go back down again. This is what the future might look like. This is what we would have seen if we never had the in-lieu deliveries. We would have seen another almost 200 feet in decline by now, for a total of 600. Just one little sort of factoid. This is the deepest pumping depression in the GMA. In terms of water balance for the basin, we have an estimate of 11,000 acre feet to that basin that's sustainable. Pumping's varying from 1,000 to a few thousand feet above that, so we have a problem here on the order of a couple thousand acre feet. Let's move to the eastern area. Again, we're talking about this portion of the basin east of the fault, and we have the shallow aquifer in this area. Earlier I said we need to manage water quality and create a supplemental supply by pumping the shallow aquifer. I also said we need to be careful not to limit too much of the recharge that's going into the deep zone, and hopefully you're wondering how you could do both. It seems kind of like a paradox. Well, this is where the surface water inflows come into the picture. We have discharges from Seaview Valley that have been coming into the basin since the 70s, and this water percolates into the shallow aquifer and has kept it full. What we'd like to do is start pumping this shallow aquifer and capture those surface water flows that are now leaving the basin. We actually have a surplus of water in the basin. We just can't effectively capture it all with our current infrastructure. So sort of the first phase of solutions will be to, in a managed fashion, pump the shallow aquifer down, make sure we're not causing impacts in the deep zone, try and capture more of the percolation, and eventually we'll reach a point where we've captured it all. Then at that point, any increased pumping will draw the shallow aquifer down, and hopefully we can capture storm water that's now leaving the basin. Right now, when we enter the wet season, the aquifer's already full. There's no room for that water to percolate. We'll probably need to help Mother Nature with that process. We have good evidence from historical data that the stormwater flows don't percolate very well on their own, so we need to look at some projects that help slow that water down so that it has more time to percolate.
Right, hold on, Brian.
And who's going to be using that water when you start drawing that down?
That water will recharge the aquifer.
The western one or the?
It'll recharge primarily in this area.
Oh, okay. So you're going to
No. He said when you pull that water out, where are you going to put that water?
That water, yes.
That water will probably, a variety of entities are proposing desalter projects. They'll pump that, they'll desalt it, they'll use it to, number one, supplement their supply, but we also need to find a way to convey that water to users in the basin who aren't in this area, but are up here and are affected by the poor quality water that's already recharged in the basin. They need blend water. So the water will be used in multiple ways to solve multiple issues.
And you'll pump it to them?
You'll have to, yeah.
Okay. Otherwise we lose that water, right, because it's too full.
I'm sorry?
We lose the water there because...
Yeah, as long as that shallow zone is full, water's just going to leave the basin. And in fact, it's been leaving the basin since the mid-90s, and it's filling up the northern part of the Pleasant Valley Basin. And it has been for 15 years. And actually, there's folks looking at developing that supply in that basin. A regional group is looking at sort of a similar concept.
Mike?
And for Supervisor Zaragoza, maybe you could reflect on the fact that we're under an order from LA Regional to clean that water up.
Yes, and very much part of this plan is to integrate with the adopted salts TMDL for the Cayugas Creek watershed. That TMDL specifically and explicitly calls out integration of salts management with water supply projects. And so this plan is very much tied in with the implementation measures that the dischargers, Simi Valley, Waterworks District 1, Cayugas is named on the order as well, this all ties in together, and that's actually one of the goals. It didn't show up on the list of goals, but it is a goal to integrate with those approaches.
Clean it up, yeah.
Clean it up, but also make it available as supply.
Good.
Because there are ways of removing the salts that don't create a new supply, and that's what we're trying to avoid.
Thank you.
This slide is just showing where the water from CME is coming in. It's coming in from two sources. Their treatment plant, about 10,000 acre-feet per year. And they also have to do dewatering of shallow groundwater in the west end of the city. Water's coming up close to the surface. That causes problems. So they pump about 3,000 acre-feet per year. All this water is discharged into Arroyo CME, flows into the basin, and begins recharging the aquifer. We also have some contribution just from urban runoff as well. You can see in this picture is quite a bit of flow. This is generally dry weather flows are between 10 to 20 CFS through the system, and that's enough water, obviously, to keep the basin in balance. As we move further to the west and follow the arroyo along, we're also adding water to the basin from the Moore Park wastewater treatment plant, a couple thousand acre-feet per year. This water isn't discharged directly to the creek. It's percolated through ponds, and given the elevation of the ponds relative to the creek, there's some of that water may actually discharge back into the creek. So it's a little unclear the fate of all that water, but suffice it to say it's a supply to the basin. By the time you get to Upland Road in the Camarillo area, you can see the creek's dry. The water's all recharged. And again, the basin boundary is right in here, so there is recharge going on in the Pleasant Valley Basin. And again, we'd like to capture as much of the water that's flowing out of the basin as possible and put it to use. One of our technical challenges in this plan, one of the key technical challenges, is quantifying the recharge that's happening along the creek system. There's inadequate gauging data in the basin to do this. This slide shows you we have just a couple gauges. They're not placed in the right places to figure out what's coming in, what's leaving, what's going into the ground. And this is critical because our estimates of overdraft and the yield of the basin, as well as how much of that yield is natural versus non-native inflows, all of those things hinge on our ability to quantify the percolation that's going on here. And that's important for two reasons. One is because that's key to how we allocate the resource, all those aspects I just described. And right now, the estimates I put together have large error bars on them. We're actually going ahead and addressing this. Callegas has funded a $100,000 study for a consultant to go out here and install temporary gauging stations along the arroyo at about half of these blue dots. We're doing a 2-month survey of the flow to figure out what the percolation is so we can update our yield estimates and give the users a more confident number for them to work with when they get to the business of developing allocations. This is the reason why we're not doing allocations in the plan right now. Some of you may have heard that and heard that that's a concern. This is the primary reason. This was my recommendation to the group. And again, the reason is there's big cost implications because the component of water that isn't native is going to have a cost associated with it. And that cost is to deal with the salts, convey it to users who need it, and use it as a supplemental supply. Those numbers will affect the cost. So enough said on that. This picture is just showing you what our temporary monitoring stations look like. So a little bit of history on the water levels in the eastern area. This cartoon is going to kind of show you what's happened. These are two of Zone's wells plotted to scale. We have elevation here and time here. Historically, we started with a full condition in the 1920s. Water levels had a pervasive decline. We were over-pumping the basin. This is what water levels probably would have looked like if Simi Valley and Moore Park never came into the picture. They would have kept going down, 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 down. And eventually out here by 2020, we'd actually be looking at dry wells in a deep confined aquifer. That's amazing. The problems that we would have had along the way, increased pumping lift, pumps would have needed to be lowered, probably would have seen intrusion of poor quality water from deeper units and so on and so forth, and again, eventually dry wells. And again, what happened instead? We had urbanization, we had people flushing their toilets, water's going into the stream system, filling up the shallow aquifer, and leaking down into the deep zone that these wells are in. Water levels rebounded, the basin filled up, and it's steadied off. The issue is managing these salts in this water. Elsewhere in the basin, in the central part of the basin, similar story. The basin didn't fill back up, it just stabilized. Then we see the effect of pumping beginning in 2007. This is the result of two things. Cayugas began their long-term extractions in that time, and the in lieu program that I mentioned before was also in place in this part of the basin for Waterworks District 1. The program ended, they went back to pumping. We saw a steep water level decline on the order of 75 to 100 feet. Pumping from Cayugas' operations have ceased. At least the long-term aspect of those has ceased. We're starting to see recovery. We hope to see water levels recover most of the way back up to what they were here. They probably won't, but what we're looking for is recovery and stabilization again. Similar story further up in the northeast part of the basin. So the good news is we have water. The bad news is we have to manage the water quality, and that's really the nutshell of the eastern area. When this non-native water came in, it immobilized pre-existing salts in the shallow aquifer, pushed them down into the deeper aquifer. Today, now we have a plume of poor quality water in the deep aquifer that's moved into the basin several miles. I expect that that water will move another mile or so into the basin, and we really have no way of stopping it, short of building a huge program to pump and treat that water or a huge program to inject a barrier. But I don't think we need to do that. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to develop the shallow supply, desalt it, and make that water available so people can blend it with their marginal quality water from their deep wells. It's a much cheaper solution. Over the long term, as the salts TMDL is implemented, and as we're able to capture some stormwater, we'll slowly improve water quality in the basin. That's a process that will take decades. It'll take just as long as this process has taken to develop to where it is today. But we think that's the cheapest approach to deal with this issue. It's important to understand that it's not just the pumpers down here in this part of the basin that cause this problem. It's really a problem that's the result of pumping throughout the whole basin. This basin was being operated in overdraft. Water levels dropped hundreds of feet across the entire basin. And so it's the overdraft condition that really allowed this recharge to happen. If the basin was not in overdraft, the deep aquifer pressures would have been much higher, and not as much of this shallow water would have made it into the basin. And this is a key concept when we start talking about why folks in the northern part of the basin need to be part of the financial solution to the problem. What does our water balance look like for the eastern area? We have something on the order of 15,000 acre feet per year of native yield. This is the water Mother Nature supplying to the basin. We have pumping that's in excess of that by anywhere from 4,000 to 7,000 acre feet per year, depending on the year. But we have our supplemental water from the recharge from the arroyo that's making up the difference between this native and pumping. And that's why the water levels have stayed stable in the basin. We also have all the water that's leaving the basin that we can make use of as long as that water continues to come in. And that's a key question. How long will we have all of this water? What is Simi Valley going to do? Simi Valley has identified approximately 6,000 acre feet per year of demand for their recycled water within the city. They have a master plan for building out to that capacity. That's a huge project. They released the first phase, or they went for approval of the first phase of that project for 1,100 acre feet. It's about $20 million is the number I've heard. They don't have the funding. So it's clear that that process of Simi Valley reclaiming a portion of their water is going to take quite a bit of time. So we have some time to work with here in terms of increasing supply and meeting demand. The worst case scenario is if Simi Valley fully develops their recycled water system and takes their dewatering discharges out of the stream system. Those dewatering discharges are really the driver for their salts TMDL compliance. When the brine line that Cayugas is constructing comes to Simi Valley, they'll have the ability to treat that water and reuse it within the city. So we expect that water goes away, and if we assume that the full build-out of the recycled water program happens, we probably end up with just enough water to deal with the eastern area. We would have a deficit because we wouldn't have enough water to deal with our pumping depression in the western part of the basin. This is long-term. This is what we're using to guide our planning for our long-term decisions that are a decade, 2 decades out. So just to recap, the groundwater management issues, again, we have the pumping depression in the western area. We need to manage water quality in the eastern area and improve it slowly over the long term. Both areas, we need to be looking at ways to increase the operational yield. In the immediate future, that's going to be developing that shallow aquifer. In the longer term, that may mean doing things to capture stormwater. It may mean looking for other sources of supplemental water from other places. And lastly, we need to, again, accommodate Cayugas' operation of their facility. So what are the strategies? Really, we phased them out in time, short-term, medium-term, long-term. Short-term is really the next 5 years or so until the brine line is in place and we can put desalters online and actually start the real solutions. Medium-term is about implementing those desalter projects, transitioning to a new allocation system that's resource-based. It's based on water availability. And setting up a program where people pay for water if they need more than what they're allocated. And that all gets back to the desalters. That's sort of vague how I described that. That's going to be next month. We'll get into how that works. I would be getting a little bit ahead of the pumpers group if I did that today. The allocation system, although that's listed here as a medium-term strategy, that's probably something that, well, we talked about it today. The group seems to be fairly committed to doing that more on the shorter term, getting that in place in a year or so that folks have certainty in their water allocation so they can make business decisions. Again, we're asking people to invest and build their own projects. They need to know what the future looks like in their water portfolio so they can make those decisions. Long term, again, it's all about increasing yield to keep up with demand. So we have some interim measures that we need to put in place that'll cover us from the time we adopt this plan, hopefully at the end of this year, until we put new allocations in place and until we get our projects online. The first of the interim measures is what do we do in terms of putting controls on pumping, and what do we do with requests for new wells in the basin? The group actually discussed this morning. We're working on new language for Chapter 4 of the agency's ordinance code. The approach there is we're going to take the elements of the plan and use those elements to define criteria that will be used for staff to look at when they're reviewing the applications. Basically what we're going to say is new use of new wells, they can't interfere with our progress towards attaining our basin management goals and objectives, and they can't interfere with implementation of management strategies. Those are the 2 key principles. You should expect that next month we'll be bringing you a first reading of an ordinance code change along those lines with the idea that we could do a second reading and adopt that in December. We want to get those things in place so that we don't have a gap between our current emergency ordinance and these new protocols. The second of our interim measures, this is actually already being implemented. Waterworks District 19 has wells in the western area in that pumping depression. They have voluntarily shifted on the order of several hundred acre-feet per year of their pumping from that area to a new well in the East Basin. And what this is going to do is a couple of things. It's immediately going to help alleviate some of the overstressing of the aquifer in that area, but it's also going to help me nail down the yield number a little bit better and confirm that number. I'm already pretty confident in that area, but this will just help a little bit more. And lastly, the group is working on a set of interim criteria for how Cayugas will operate their ASR facility. And when I say interim, what I mean by that is there are criteria in place that the board has approved in the past. Cayugas has learned a lot about how that facility works and affects the basin, and the impacts are larger than were understood to be before they operated. So they're going to put in place some very conservative criteria for how they'll operate for now. Basically, inject water before you pump it out, mostly short duration. They're going to accommodate for emergency scenarios. But the idea is that we could do this in a controlled fashion and not impact the pumpers. We're going to study the basin, perhaps do some modeling, and through those tasks, and Cayuse is going to implement a monitoring program around their facility. All those things are going to roll together. They're going to learn more about how their facility affects the basin. We should be able to revise those criteria and provide for more comprehensive use of that basin, not only for Cayuse's purposes, but perhaps to the benefit of the pumpers and perhaps as part of implementation of some of our strategies. We have some planning tasks that we'll need to accomplish in the next 5 years. We got to do our allocations. Again, we're looking at that being done in the short term. We need to develop protocols for how we're going to manage the shallow aquifer. I already hit on that earlier. We're going to need to develop our desalting and conveyance options, and this is a huge task. We need to figure out who's building desalters, where the source water is coming from, how we're going to move that water around. I can't understate how much work still needs to be done on this in the next 5 years, really before 5 years, because you need a couple of years to get all your permits and get things constructed. So we have a lot of work to do. We're going to convene, or I'm going to recommend to the group that we form what I'm going to call a desalter task force. We want to get a subset of folks who are interested in building those projects, get them into a room, start talking about what their plans are, start talking about costs. We need to know the costs because that's going to come back into how we develop our supplemental water and pay for it by the broader group. And Cayuse will update their operational criteria on their terms, on their schedule as they learn more about the basin. And we also want to begin planning for those longer term projects and keeping our ear to the ground on opportunities to co-op with others. One example might be flood control projects that could also have dual purpose for serving some sort of recharge capacity. So we want to make sure that we're not so focused on what we're doing now that we're missing opportunities that would come to fruition down the road. We've pretty much talked all about this, so I'm just going to continue through. Issues we need to address. Data gaps. I already talked about the uncertainty in the eastern area yield. We're taking actions to deal with that now. Longer term, we're going to need to do studies. We're probably going to need to do modeling. I won't say any more than that. It's pretty self-explanatory. Our allocation system, we have a really difficult issue to deal with when we develop these allocations, and that is there is a large amount, relatively speaking, a large amount of land that's zoned, open space, ag, that's currently not used. This is different from the rest of the agency. Oxnard Plain, every square inch is already used. Las Posas, it isn't. We have hillsides and other areas that have never been planted that could be brought into production. How do we deal with that? We're trying to stay resource-based, yet we may have new demands. There's issues there that we haven't worked through. We're going to need legal review by the GMA. You can expect an item next month. Perhaps they'll be requesting use of some budget to get outside counsel, special counsel, to look at our ordinance code and give us advice on how to deal with unirrigated land. We also need the board to provide us, from a policy perspective, feedback on this issue when we get to that point. I'm not asking for that today. I did want to put it on the table, though, so you can start thinking about it. The desalter task force, I already described that. We also need to have some dialogue about Las Posas user groups' future role in basin management decisions. Here you have a group that your board has delegated responsibility to develop this plan. These folks are also going to invest a lot of money in projects. They probably need some role in the decision-making that's done by the agency and how the rules are set up and things and so on and so forth. So we'll need to have a discussion at some point about how best to integrate that group as an advisory committee or advisory group that it provides recommendations to your board and staff on key decisions like well permitting, new uses, and future decisions that we're not even thinking about today. Okay, so that's pretty much the end of the presentation. The two items I'm looking for feedback on now are the interim measures in terms of process for adopting those, and then I'll ask for your feedback on process for adopting the plan. So the interim measures that we're working on, again, modifying Chapter 4 of the Ordinance Code. We're looking at continuing a 4 acre-foot per acre cap per year on pumping as an interim measure. We're also looking at those criteria I described for determining how proposed new uses may or may not have a net detriment on the basins. And we're also considering perhaps writing in a deadline for implementation of the new allocation systems beginning 2013. There was mixed feedback on that. We're still debating that issue. It may be the case that we come back and have a more flexible approach, but ask the board to state a directive to the group to do that in that time frame and not necessarily write it into the ordinance code. We're still working through that. I prepared a schedule for developing this plan back in January, and that schedule recommended I'm sorry, I'm ahead of myself. On the interim measures, again, we'll be proposing a first reading in October and asking you to hold a hearing and consider adoption in December. So at this point, I just want to confirm that you're okay with that approach, the timing, and what we're going to be bringing to you.
Okay. Before we address that specific issue, any members have any questions on the previous stuff that Brian spoke about? Anybody in the audience have any specific questions? Okay. You asked, I think, before we got to this slide, feedback. Are we, the board, comfortable with the short-term, medium-term, long-term strategy of working ourselves over a period of time?
Yes.
And in concept coming up with a modification to the ordinance to give you the time to get through this initial short-term period?
Yes.
Period, right?
Yes,
so let's address that issue. Anybody have any problems with that as a strategy and process that the group is going through? No, I think that's a good strategy. All right, so now we're at this issue here, interim measures. The group met this morning, as I understand, and these are literally fresh off the burner.
They are. I wrote the slide last night before the meeting, hoping that this would still be good.
You're an optimistic individual. So, all right.
I had a plan B.
Yeah. Oh, plan B. We're not looking at plan B right now. Let me go around the board, and then we'll go to the audience. This slide here. Dave, you okay with this process?
Yes.
Mike?
Yes.
Charlotte? John? Yes. Okay. We're all in agreement. This is the correct way to do it, and I believe that the process is to modify the ordinance so we don't have to get into the process of once again dealing with an emergency ordinance, which I think all of us have, or not all of us, but this is a better way of doing it. Okay. And the first reading in October and second reading in December. The emergency ordinance expires in December, so they fill in the gap.
Yes.
Okay. Everybody okay with this process? We said yes. All right, so there's your answer.
Okay.
All right. Oh, hold on a second. I'm sorry. Anybody in the audience have any concerns about this process? Going once and going twice. Done. Okay, very good.
Okay. And process for adoption of the plan. LPUG's continuing to work extremely hard. I'm just every time I go to the meeting, I'm surprised how hard folks are working. We're meeting semi-monthly. We actually added an extra meeting today to try and keep on pace, and I hear people laughing.
You're more than optimistic, right?
I'm trying to be. This is the cheerleader part. We're going to do. They're going to do everything in their power to reach consensus by December. The best outcome is we come to you in December with a plan that either the previous meeting or that morning we can say we have consensus on. And so we may be in a position to ask your board to adopt that plan as early as December. I prepared a schedule back in January before we got into this whole process. And the way I laid it out was really two steps. In October, we'd be close to group consensus. We'd do a workshop. We'd tell you everything about that plan. Well, the plan's big. I started that process today. You got the first part of the workshop today. So we have another opportunity in October to go through more of the granularity of the plan, the details. And if your board's comfortable with the level of information you've received at that point, we would ask you in December to hold a public hearing and consider adopting this plan.
Okay.
So I'm seeking feedback on that schedule.
I think, going around again, everybody okay with that? Yes.
Workable schedule? You can work with that schedule? Yeah.
I can. My concern was more with you folks and making sure that you've had enough, you've been presented enough information, you've had enough time to digest it and ask questions. This is a big deal, and we obviously don't want to rush something of this magnitude. So,
I think that we will make ourselves knowledgeable on it because I think it's important. The group has done a tremendous job, no question about it, and I don't want the board holding them up. I think it's important to get a change to the ordinance, an initial plan in place before the emergency ordinance expires. That buys us all time to move forward, and once we start building the momentum, I think it's good for everybody. So I'm okay with this schedule. Everybody's, I think I'm hearing, okay?
okay. The burden's back on the group.
What's that?
The burden's back on the group.
Yeah. In the plan, when you actually look through all the things you're proposing and the amount of capital structure, the financial cost associated with all the pumpers that are going to be involved in this, somewhere along the line, we need to build into the plan some kind of validation methodology. I don't know what that is. I would hate to have a case where some individuals are working hard, paying their fees, and then down the road we get a complaint that somebody is paying their fees, working hard, and somebody is gaming the system off to the side. And over the years, I think the GMA has taken a fairly benign attitude towards enforcement, if you want, more of a trusting issue. And we have, as you well know, over time found some individuals that have moved off the reservation, and we've gone through a long and lengthy process to bring them back into compliance. And they're paying hefty fees for that. So somewhere in the plan, I think you're going to have to look at some kind of compliance mechanism. And I would rather have your group figure out how you're going to do that than to put the burden on the board and our staff to sit down 2 years, 3 years, 4 years down the road and then have to be the cops, if you will, to find out how to deal with people that are not playing the system correctly. I think you need to build that into the front end, and I think there's examples out there. There's different agencies that do this process, and I would encourage you to do the research on that, either you folks or staff, and maybe there's folks in the audience that know of different methodologies. I think you ought to build that into it as well, and people don't want to hear about validation measures, but the truth of the matter is it's when you're going to start spending the kind of money that you're going to spend, and you're going to put the kind of responsibility and burden that you're going to put on the local pumpers, use the GMA as kind of the umbrella to make sure that fair is fair. We all have to put in place some methodology so we don't get into a fight down the road. So you might have to look into that.
I think that was one of the objectives that you had, the equitable distribution. I can't remember which one it was. That's what you're...
I think it dovetails nicely into that
portion
objective.
of it, yeah.
Okay.
Fairness, equity. I'll report this back to the group.
Okay, very good. Anybody else in the audience? Bob.
Good afternoon, Chairman O'Hort and board members. My name is Robert Aranio. I'm here on behalf of Crestview Mutual Water Company. Crestview Mutual Water Company, as you may know, is on the western portion of the West Las Posas Basin, and we're serving both residential and agricultural customers over there. We rely both on groundwater and Cayugas imports. Currently, we're relatively in good shape with whereabouts our wells are located and the part of the basin in which we're located and drawing from. But we recognize that not all the basin is equal, and that a basin-specific management plan is very necessary in order to make sure that that problem doesn't exacerbate or become worse over time. And we're ensuring that we're participating in that process in order to get to that point. Finally, like to agree with the fact that a basin-specific management plan, I think, is a much better approach than a big bucket where one size fits all. And we're involved with talking with each other and learning to trust each other in trying to get these issues addressed. And finally, my last note is, as a person that's been involved in several of the committees over the years, starting off with the meter calibration, working through emergency ordinance E and whether or not that was anything, or the conservation credits. I would like to express my sincere appreciation to the board for giving the Las Posas Basin the authority to put this basin-specific management plan together as the local pumpers and stakeholders out there, and give us the opportunity in order to work through this process and come up with a program that works for what we're doing out there.
Okay,
Thanks,
Robert. Carol?
Good afternoon, Chairman Mulhart, board members. I'm Carol Schoen, General Manager for Zone Mutual Water Company. Zone covers about 5,700 acres in the Las Posas area. So we stretch from about Center School Road all the way to Balcom Road and kind of along both sides, long stretch. And we're on both sides of the basin. We're deliver into the west and we deliver into the east. We have 10 wells. 5 are in the east with poor quality water, 5 are in the west, but impacted by the pumping depression. We are along the arroyo where we can take advantage of putting in a desalter to help mitigate any of the depression pumping possibly in the future. And we appreciate the GMA's support today in backing up what Brian and Henry and Susan have all been working. We've all been working so hard to come together. It's really important. Zone's going to have a tremendous outlay if we do step into the desalting program. We want to be assured that it's going to be a solution for our shareholders and for both basins. So thank you for your support, and I think that this is the way that we'll secure a future for the Las Posas in agriculture.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Dave?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the board, staff, and council. My name is David Schwabauer. I'm a managing partner in Levens Ranches. I am at the eastern end of the East Las Posas Basin. I manage and pump and grow lemons and avocados in an area that will be one of those that will first go dry if we don't figure out how to manage our basin from a comprehensive level. I think when we look at this plan, we look at the basins, we look at it from a big picture view, and we look at it from a contemporary view. I think that's really important. You know, if we look at a historical perspective with regards to this agency, as someone else commented, we had a big bucket view, if you will. I think one of the things that the Las Posas group has really come to grapple with is the hydrogeology of our area is so much more complex than it was when this agency was first formed. And I think that's been one of the really beneficial aspects of meeting the way in which we have with the staff that we have had, be it through the GMA, be it through Callegas, be it through the help of United. We have been extremely fortunate to have the ability to look at the challenges we face geologically underneath us. When we talk about the water that comes down the creek and the value that that has, it's immense. If I look at my pumping at the Far East area, we need to have a comprehensive means to involve those who are down next to the creek, who are having the salts issue, to figure out a way to use that water and then allow them to relieve some of the pressure on the deep basin, which will help those of us at the far end to maintain our pumping. Trying to pump water, which is down next to the creek, all the way up the hill is going to be terribly expensive. So we need to figure out how to use that water in a close proximity to the creek and then relieve that pressure, and that will help all of us. I just want to say thank you to this board, and I want to say thank you to all the staff members. It has been an extremely valuable exercise, and I really appreciate the support from you folks, and I appreciate the support from everyone involved.
Thanks, Dave. Susan?
Chairman Melhart and the board, I also want to echo what the others have said. We really appreciate you delegating this task and responsibility to the local pumpers to develop this plan and trusting us to do it. Susan Mulligan, General Manager, Cayugas Municipal Water District. Cayugas, as you know, is an imported water wholesaler. The entire Las Bosas Basin, which is covered by the management plan, is in our service area. So we have an interest and a goal in making sure that that whole area has a reliable water supply, whether that's purchased from Cayugas or whether it comes out of the ground. That all fits within our mission. Over the past 20 years, we've made a multi-million-dollar investment in 18 wells to store water in the basin and be able to pull it out. We need a plan that lets us operate in harmony with our neighbors. And the reason we need the plan to work is we need to know that when we put water in that basin, we can get it back out. And so the basin's got to be sustainable. We also prefer not to go through the time, the headache, and the cost of an adjudication. And that's why we're in this process and dedicated to making this process work. We're committed to the way of proceeding that Brian outlined, to go through and understand the issues and then address them when we have the information, and we're dedicated to getting that information soon. We think that's the way to go. Cayugas learned the hard way that some of the ways we understood the basin to work didn't. We had a model that didn't work. We ran our wells during the drought. It had impacts that were not good and that we didn't anticipate were going to happen. So we're committed to doing it right and making sure that we really understand how it works. That's why our board agreed to invest in the study that will evaluate stream flow and where the basin's getting recharged, how much it's getting recharged to the deep aquifer. We've entered into a couple of agreements with United, who has kindly agreed to share their staff with us as their staff's available. They are going to have their staff expand the regional model that they're working so hard on right now in the Santa Clara River area over to Las Posas when they're done with their part of it, so that we really have a regional model. Cayugas' board has signed an agreement to work with United on this and fund developing that model in the Las Posas Basin. That's how important this is to us. We've developed significant staff time to date in working on this plan. And again, we're paying United for some of Brian's time to put together this plan. All of this is support of our board. They understand how important it is that this basin operates sustainably. So we embrace the challenge. We're prepared to continue working hard, and our board is supportive of it. And just wanted to let you know that we're in it for the long haul, and we're going to continue to work hard and dedicate resources to making this a success.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? All right. Any board member comments or anything? Anything? I want to compliment the group on the work that they've done. If you look at where we were a number of years ago, I'm not sure we were all mentally prepared to go through the exercise that we're going through now. Brian, the leadership you've brought, Steve and Susan and Henry, I'm amazed that Henry can go to these meetings and talk and type at the same time. I don't know how he does that. I saw your wife at the museum thing, and I said to her, I don't know how he does that. She goes, I don't know how he does that either, but Henry's able to do that. If you look at what we've really doing here, is that we've created a umbrella organization, the GMA, that has some legal authority to give some stability and avoid the adjudication process. And by going out to the constituents and having them work through their problem and come to grips with their problem, they're going to have to buy into it, they're going to have to pay for it and make it work over time, and not create another mini agency, but in fact utilize the existing structure we have right now. It's probably a good balance. It's a very slow process. It's a tedious process, but it's the best process rather than asking us to come up with some ruling and then having you guys throw rocks, I think is what the term was. So I am pleased with the progress you're making. I'm pleased with the time frame and the adjustments that you've made so we can transition from one system to another system and buy ourselves the time. So do we need, yeah.
I'm new here. I'm just the alternate, but I just I like the partnership that Callegas and United and the stakeholders and the GMA are working together to solve this problem. You know, because like somebody said, that bucket is there, and some people get good water, some people don't, and just the partnership of working together as you know, with United and Callegas and the stakeholders and the GMA board is just fantastic. So I don't realize maybe the amount of work that you guys have put together, but it sounds great because it looks like everybody's happy to some degree. And thank you.
Okay. Does the board need, we don't have to do any formal vote or anything? Is there no, other than the verbal commitment you've heard, there's no formal action we have to take, is that correct? Okay, receive and file. Okay.
So move.
All right.
Second.
Motion and a second. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Hearing none. All right, let's move on to the next. Thank you. Let's move on to the next one, 6.
5.
Or 5, I'm sorry.
Chair Molhart, board members, members of the audience, Gerhard Hubner, Watershed Protection District. I'll be presenting this item. Probably, it's an important item, probably not as exciting as the previous discussion item, but this is consideration of a formal procedure to allow for reconsideration of motions and previous decisions made at previous board meetings. And I have a short presentation. I can go through it at your pleasure, or
let me, if I may, let me summarize what the question is. So we can see if we can keep moving along. This issue was brought before the board as a result of reconsidering an issue that was raised at a previous meeting, and all the board members have had a chance to look through the packet of what's being outlined. Do you have any specific questions about what's being proposed? If you go through the recommendations of staff is, there's 3 recommendations. 1, do nothing, status quo. The other one is to adopt the Roberts Rules of Order, or 3rd, to adopt basically out of the county's administrative manual. And the staff's recommendation is to adopt option number 3. Having read through option number 3 and essentially a reprint of the county's manual.
I have a comment.
Yes, ma'am.
And my comment's in regard to option number 2. It says adopt Robert's Rules of Order or other city administrative policies. And even though I had sent other, what the League of Cities recommends, that was not put in here. And Robert's Rules isn't in here. So I'm not sure how anybody would know what they are to consider the other 2. But I did go to the trouble of calling a parliamentarian who just happened to be a friend of mine, but he was in Florida at a parliamentarians convention.
Perfectly.
when he called me back, and he told me what Robert's Rules does, and it's probably sitting in the seat of my car. But essentially, Robert's Rules makes a distinction and says that reconsideration can only be at the same board meeting. That's to reconsider something. And it goes through basically the same process that the county has here. If you're going to do it at a subsequent meeting, then Robert's Rule says that the previous decision has to be rescinded and you have to do something else. So you're not really reconsidering it. You might have other things you add to the mix of what the outcome would be as well. So that's a distinction, a slight distinction. But it also, Robert's Rules also says that you have to do it at the same board meeting to reconsider, and if you're going to then you can also reconsider at the very next meeting, but not at any subsequent meeting, because it would be, you'd have to bring it all back and rescind the previous motion if you were going to do that. I did bring something that the League of Cities has, and it's only about 4 paragraphs, but I do want to tell you that the reason that I have one of them marked up. The reason that they feel that you cannot go too long before you bring it back for whatever you're going to call it, reconsideration or rescinding, is because the object of an action of a board is finality. And if you're going to always keep bringing it back, then you don't have something that's final. And that you lose the confidence of the public or whoever you're working with. Here we're working with the public.
When you said they feel, they being League
the League of Cities.
Okay.
That's what this is about. There was one other thing that I neglected to say. Well, it doesn't matter.
Let me ask this question. Since you took the time to look at both Roberts, the League of Cities, we have the county's language here, what would you like to do?
I think at the last meeting I was against reconsideration. After reading all of these things, I think that a combination, I think the county's thing where you can bring it back at any time, it does not, it isn't timely. I think that making it so that you can always add to reconsider at the same meeting, and then at the following meeting, I think is fine too. But it has to be brought up by a person who actually voted for,
to reconsider,
who was on the prevailing side and voted for the item. And that's in all of them, that has to make the motion. And then anybody can second the motion to reconsider the item.
If as I understand your explanation of Roberts and others, if you bring it back at the following meeting by the person that was on the prevailing side, that's a reconsideration. If you want to reconsider it or redeal with it 5-6 months down the road, what you have to do is get a motion to rescind that one and start all over again.
Yes, you have to bring it back as a new agenda item to be rescinded. The other part of Robert's rules, and this is what I had forgotten and neglected to say, is that if any action has been taken between those meetings, in other words, if somebody was notified, if a contract was signed, if there was something to indicate finality, then you cannot reconsider it at the next meeting.
Well, why don't we do this? Since you have a copy of Roberts and this, let's give this to staff.
Okay.
Can you bring this back to us at a subsequent board meeting so that all the board members have a chance to read through the 3 options? And you actually, in effect, heard a 4th option. And the 4th option, let me even back up further. Is there anybody that wants to stay with the status quo, or do you think we need to change something?
We need to change it.
Yeah. Okay. So option 1, as your list is not a viable option. So we're only dealing with options 2 and 3. And then Charlotte has suggested, in effect, a 4th option. And that 4th option is a modification that it only can come back on the county side, only come back at the subsequent meeting, not at any future meeting.
I understood that to be the League of Cities approach.
That's
okay. So, but what she was saying is an option would be to adopt the county's procedure, but make the subsequent meeting only one following meeting. You can't.
Okay.
Yeah, the word subsequent means any meeting out in the future, and she's trying to limit it to one.
Mr. Chairman, in support of Ms. Craven's statements, one of the offending things I found with this was it was decided at a March meeting, and it wasn't until the applicant brought it to our attention at the July meeting that nothing had gone on. We had an April, May, and a June meeting where the staff had taken no action. And so this would, if we proceed as Ms. Craven has suggested, that would prevent such a ridiculous thing from happening again. And so I really think you need some finality, as you stated. You know, people can't just be hanging out there at the end of a limb wondering when the breeze is going to blow them off. So I think it's important. There's one more thing I would like to ask as just a definition, if not, and that would be board members who currently, it seems like the method of choice here is if you're trying to bring something, you have to kind of squeeze it in through staff. Is there a mechanism in place now, or can we in this process place a mechanism where a board member has an item they wish to have considered, that they can bring it directly to the board and get it agendized and not have to do a beg and twist and with the staff to get it on the staff? I mean, it seems to me rather ridiculous. It's the first place I've ever worked where you couldn't bring something directly to the agenda.
We do that in our board, like saying that we'd like to bring an item, before the board
and future agenda.
Yeah, but I don't think there's anything that prevents you from doing that now.
No.
If you said at this board meeting, I would like to have on next month's meeting an agenda item dealing with this issue, I don't think there's any reason to stop that. The problem is that no one's really used that methodology.
Yeah, typically the county's policy is if the board member wants to bring it independent, the board member prepares it. And so there's nothing that prevents that. Nor has anyone ever been forced to twist. We've never ever refused the board members a request for something on the agenda. At least in my tenure here, we're quick to put it on and quick to support it and write it up. But if you bring it independently, the expectation would be you write it up. And typically the board members in the county have, they can put things on sort of at the very last minute, if you like, and it gets added as an addendum to the agenda. They don't have to meet. We have everything ready to go about 3 weeks prior, print it out.
So it would come on that following board meeting or the board meeting following the following?
Yeah, you'd have to decide your own rules. Like the notification the county uses 48 hours for the public noticing. So up to 40, so that usually means the board members have to get it in the Friday before the Tuesday meeting. It's 48 business days, right?
72
hours. 72. But so they have to get theirs in by Friday, whereas everyone else has to be on the agenda about a week earlier.
But we have the freedom to do that.
But that gives you enough time to do the official notifications and stuff for agenda.
Yeah, we'd send it out as an addendum, and then we'd make the copies of the materials available at the door when they came through, because it wouldn't be part of the printed package.
Okay, well,
so then theoretically, any board member ought to be able to do the same thing, as long as it was in by Friday.
Does your plan require a 3 board members to agree to have this agendized, or is it automatically agendized?
It's up to you. You present it as your item. You bring all the background research, and that's the way.
Because the appeal process we're discussing requires a majority vote to have it come back.
Because it's already been voted on.
Right.
And obviously it had a majority vote or it wouldn't have passed.
Right. And even now,
so therefore, you have to have a majority to say yes, we want to look at it again.
Okay, so we don't totally mix apples and oranges here.
Right.
The issue of getting an item on the agenda, there's never been a restriction. It doesn't require a quorum of the board. It's every board member has a right. Staff, I want you to deal with this issue on the agenda. Here's my information, and you can take it up to 72 business hours prior to the meeting.
Yes, with one distinction there. Usually your board asks us to put agenda items on just any time. We always just, okay, we do it, we get it done, we meet the deadline. I think what Board Member Kelly's talking about is when a board member wants to just put it on without going through staff, there wouldn't be any report or information to staff other than the report that usually it's just a placeholder letter saying something, I'd like to present this item on this day. And if there are any materials that you want, like exhibits, we can copy those, put them in the front, make them available. But on Friday, we send out the notice that it's to meet the Brown Act requirements or the public notification requirements.
So essentially, there's two options. You can say to staff, I want you to do, on the agenda, I want a discussion about X, Y, Z. And staff will say, okay, given this time frame, we're going to have to do the research. We won't get it on this agenda, but it'll be on the subsequent month. If you say, no, I want it on this month, and they don't have time to do it, it doesn't preclude you from saying, look, I'll bring all the material, but I want to talk about it at the following meeting. The only thing you have is a deadline to meet the notification time frame. Okay?
Just to put your maybe thought at ease, I don't have anything I'm planning to bring.
Oh.
I just was kind of wondered in this particular organization how it would work, and I thank you for your help.
Okay, so that's item number one. Let's move that one. Let's go back to the question at hand, if I may. And the question at hand is we have a staff recommendation. Charlotte has challenged it by saying she has looked at Robert's rules in the number two. And she's even thrown out...
Number 2 is really two things. If you're going to look at everything, it would be 1, 2, 3, and 4.
And she's added a fourth one. My proposal is, I don't think that we have to decide on this today, and I would submit, if Charlotte would give her information to staff, let them reproduce it, so we have the full issue, and that way we have an educated decision. Yes, sir.
Maybe to staff of Jeff. Did item number 3 for the county, does that... Did that come from CSAC? Does CSAC have something that we can work with?
I'm not sure.
Or maybe county council?
It's from straight out of the county administrative manual.
That's right. The question is that, you know. No.
I don't know.
Well, that's okay. That's probably part of the research. Maybe that.
Yeah, we can find that out.
Okay.
What do you think, Charlie?
That's fine.
Okay, you guys okay with the recommendation to put it back to staff?
I was just wondering if Ms. Craig might have an opinion. Which one, at this moment in time, which do you think is the preferred, Roberts or the League of Cities?
I think that Roberts would be fine because it pretty much is like the counties, except the county says you can bring it back at any meeting, as I read it, and Roberts says you can only bring it back at the next meeting.
Right. Well,
and I think that is preferable.
In staff's discussion, that was a singular thing they found offensive about Roberts, was that it didn't allow you to do that. Well, I agree, it probably shouldn't allow you to do that. So
then number 3.
Because otherwise we wouldn't have had this 3 months wait. So, thank you.
All right.
Okay.
But I think the chair, your recommendations are good.
Okay, you guys okay with my recommendation? So, okay. All right. That way, even the public has a chance to look at all 3 and see what we're going to talk about, and we're not doing it in the blind. All right. That's the recommendation. Let's go to item number 6.
Good afternoon, Chair Mulhart, members of the board. For the record, my name is Rick Deergoose. I do not have a presentation for this, but I'm here to talk about item 6, adjustment to the City of Camarillo extraction allocation in accordance with Section 5.3 of the Ordinance Code. In March, we presented an item that discussed agricultural to municipal and industrial allocation transfers. We had a long discussion. Staff discussed that under certain cases, and we talked about some general ones at that meeting, that it's difficult, if not impossible, to make the finding of no net detriment. And as a result, staff wasn't able to make that finding and wasn't recommending approval of those requests. After a lot of discussion, your board told staff that that issue of no net detriment, making that finding of no net detriment, is not required for those allocation transfers. That's not the way the ordinance is supposed to be interpreted, and that staff is to approve those and bring those back to your board for approval. And so that's what we've done. Item 6 is 2 applications from the City of Camarillo for agricultural to municipal and industrial allocation transfers, and our recommendation is that your board approves those.
Okay. Anybody have any questions? I think it's consistent with what we've done in the past when we've taken ag land and brought it into the M&I fold. We brought it in at 2 acre feet. That's what we're doing here.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we approve the application that signed by Jeff Pratt on September 21 to transfer the credits.
Okay, a motion? A second? Let's do a roll call. Yes, sir.
There's a second application in here.
Can we do them as, it's the same recommendation for both of them?
Al, what do we do on this? We have 2 applications. Do we make separate
recommendation? Do the motion, one big motion for both?
I move that we accept both
Okay.
applications signed on September 21, 2011.
Okay, a motion and a second. Anybody? Roll call, please.
Chair Mulhart?
Yes.
Director Craven?
Yes.
Director Zaragoza?
Yes.
Director Kelly?
Yes.
Director Borchard?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to item number 7.
Good afternoon. My name is Christian Labor. I'm a contract geologist for the agency, back in front of you after several years after.
You're an ex-GMAer is what you are, right?
Yeah. So,
good to see you.
thank you. Good to see you all. Items, this is, the slide is mislabeled. Originally it was item 8, is now item 7. It's an enforcement case, part of the suite of enforcement cases the agency has been pursuing for several years, some of internally with the staff and some with the help of our organization. The party is Mr. Chris Rodenfels, and these are his state well numbers. There's an extensive board letter that covers the history of the case and our enforcement. If you'd like me to go through some of those details.
Let me, for the sake of time, let's not do that. I'm going to ask if the board members had a chance to review. It's a very lengthy staff discussion and a huge chronology of letters going over a long period of time. And yes, ma'am.
Have a comment. I don't think we need to go through it. Haven't we all read it?
Yeah.
My comment is, at some point, you just have to say people are not following what they're supposed to follow, and you have to proceed with the penalties. I mean, you can only be, otherwise there's no point in having the ordinance.
Okay.
If I could just get clarification, it looks to me from this back page here, Table 2, there's a kind of a rundown of all the charges that were levied, and it seems to me that staff is proposing that, in fact, the extraction charges were paid, and what has not been paid are the interest penalties and the civil charges, the civil penalties. And what staff is proposing is that they waive the interest charges and continue to go after the civil penalties. Is that a correct assessment?
Yeah, if the payment is made within a short time frame, that is correct.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then thinking was to incentivize the quick payment and resolution of the matter?
That is correct.
Okay.
Okay. It's a difference of almost another $6,000 is what it is. That's okay. Any comments? Anybody? All right. What motion would you guys like to make? Do we have to do it as a motion? What do you need?
Yes.
Just a recommendation or a motion? Okay. All right. The recommendation is that the civil penalties not be waived and that they be assigned a fee of $3,900. If it's not paid within 10 days, then the full amount of $98,63.83 is due and payable, and it will continue to accrue interest and penalties. Agreed?
Move the approval.
All right, that's a motion to approve.
In clarification, if this payment isn't made in 10 days, then what is the next step? Is it just the $9,800, or are you also going to pursue the $1,000 a day thing?
If he doesn't pay in 10 days, sorry, he didn't pay in 11. It'll start accruing all interest down to the full amount.
Continue.
Yeah.
Does the 10 days start on the moment of receipt of notification? Does it not today?
I believe so. I would defer to counsel on that issue.
Well, it would be whatever your board decides. You could start the time running from the date of his receipt or from the date of the letter notifying him. But
Typically, if I could...
With a difficult owner, sometimes you have to demonstrate that you've reached them, as we've learned in the past, and I think we need some proof that we've told them.
Well, and in this case, we've actually been more successful with email. He's responded through email and not through the certified or the registered letters.
Well, as long as you don't erase your emails, it works good.
Then you got to give him. You got to give him. My opinion is you give him 10 days from the time he's notified. That way, we have a time certain, a date that he's notified. 10 days, it's done. Okay.
We'll do both. We'll do it all different. Email, certified.
Okay. All right, hold on a second here. We have a motion to adopt this. We can get into this discussions. Yes.
I just want to clarify one aspect that's in option 2. The way the option is written, if there's a failure to pay within the 10 days, the charges not only include the $9,000, but also surcharges for groundwater extracted, which is a much higher number from 2008 and 2010.
Okay. So what we need to do is have a motion to adopt option 2. That's the staff's recommendation. And then the 10-day payment is from the time he's notified. That's the only adjustment. Okay?
That is correct.
Charlotte, you understand that?
But option, yes.
All right,
That's fine.
Is that your motion?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm still unclear, though. So lay it out for me, please. The 10 days is the $3,900. All done.
That is correct.
If it doesn't make the 10-day payment, then he's got the $3,900 plus surcharges on the 561 acre feet.
That is correct, because he would have not have completed. Part of the civil penalties is filing the retroactive irrigation efficiency. Short of that, he has no allocation. Thus, he's subject to the portion of the ordinance that charges payment for extraction without allocation.
Which is greater than $1,000.
That is correct, per acre foot. And the rationale is these wells were never registered with the agency, and there is no historical allocation for these wells.
In a way, it seems like double charging, but that is kind of the intent of the penalty scheme, is to bring people into compliance. So,
jeez, and with the letter bank that he's having,
and there seems to have been adequate notification, and then this $1,000 a day thing, that's option 3. That is not going to be pursued.
Not at this point.
That's right.
That's in the ordinance code. That's always a remedy for you. At some point,
kind of a last ditch.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So again, let me go back up. We have a motion to adopt ordinance number 2. Do we have a second?
Well, option number 2.
Option number 2. My mistake. Okay. Motion is second. We've had all the discussion. Anybody else? Okay. Let's have a roll call on that, please.
Chair Mulhart?
Yes.
Director Craven?
Yes.
Director Zaragoza?
Yes.
Director Kelly?
Yes.
Director Borchard?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Chris. We have item number 8. That's Dr. Stiles. He is not here. I don't see him in the audience yet. So we're going to go to item number 9. And we'll finish item number 9. And then if Dr. Stiles is back at that point, or he's coming down from San Luis Obispo, I think. He's got meetings. Okay. Item number 9.
Gerhard Huebner again, for the record.
For time, John's got to leave in 35 minutes. So I'd like to get to a point where I can see if I can get a vote here on this thing in 30 minutes, so we have the full board here. So, and I think there's some public folks that want to comment. John wants to comment on this. That's what he told me. So, yes? Yeah, okay. All right. So go quick.
All right.
Like a bunny.
I will go quickly. Here we go.
You like that. Susan liked that. You like a bunny.
Sounds
like my mother.
As you know, you've been following this issue for quite a while. Going back to 2010, you had study sessions, follow-up sessions. We presented the summary of the current state of the conservation credits. We provided you with several redemption management options at your last meeting, and you directed us to come back. I'm going to just jump ahead to today to come back with this
with an item that addressed some of the accumulated accounts, in particular the inactive operator accounts. So that's why we're here today. So what did staff do? Well, we queried the database, and in order to capture the type and number of possible credits labeled inactive, we conducted a query of the database from 85 to 2010. The initial query filtered out all the COM codes, or the accounts, that had 0 annual production and a credit balance greater than 0. And this query resulted in 101 accounts being captured, totaling 140,481 acre-feet of credits accumulated in those accounts. So that was the first query, that was the accounts, and that's kind of the number that you heard at some of these previous workshops in terms of inactive accounts or potential credits that we could capture with this effort. So we then further did another query, put another series of filters in place, and then we looked at what the destroyed or the abandoned wells, as they were defined as abandoned or destroyed with a well permit with the county groundwater section and per our county well ordinance. And those inactive accounts are defined as those containing at least one destroyed, inactive, or abandoned well. So essentially no active wells, and or those non-reporting operators. So again, we refined this from active to inactive. The active accounts were defined as operator accounts within our database of 5 years or greater. So you have a time period. And no activity means no semi-annual statements were reported to the agency, 0 pumping submitted, or the operator no longer operated a well or resides in the agency. So using this filter resulted in 76,106 acre-feet of conservation credits and 48 operator accounts. So we then looked at the mechanism of how do we deal with these credits that we just accounted for. And we believe that the ordinance, because credits are in our ordinance, that an ordinance change would need to be proposed to deal with them. And that is what's proposed today and is attached as item 9B. So this is a first reading. We propose to do this in 2 readings. First reading today. This is per your direction. We draft a proposed ordinance 8.5 to address some of the accumulated conservation credits in inactive operator accounts linked to abandoned or destroyed wells. If you adopt this ordinance and it's ultimately adopted, 76,100 credits will be removed from the agency's database. I do want to note that no historical or baseline allocation, nor will anybody's operator count be deleted or reduced by this ordinance change. Again, I'm pointing out this is only a small portion of the 700,000 credits that are on the account, about 10%. Nevertheless, we do feel it's a good first start or first step, at least in addressing some of the credit issues we presented to you previously.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Do we know how many abandoned wells we have or inactive wells? Do we know how many?
We do. You mean within the GMA? Yeah. We do. I don't have that number. I can get that number.
That's okay. But that's about 10% of the...
I don't have that percentage.
Okay.
You have 3 options that you can, that are proposed. You could status quo, no change. You could create a greater credit policy. You could go back and redirect us to encompass more credit accounts or more operator accounts or different type of credit redemption or accumulation policy. And option 3 is what we propose today. You can consider and advance the proposal 8.5, or you can revise it to extinguish some of these credits accumulated in inactive accounts linked to abandoned or destroyed wells. We do have the proposed ordinance language in here. I don't know, Miranda, if I'm required to actually read that, but it's in italicized on page 2 or 3.
Before you get that far, don't read that. I'm watching the clock here. You saw it. It's in our staff report. Okay. So let me stop you there. I see your recommendation is to go with number 3.
Yes.
Let me go to the board first. Dave, your finger's on the button. I will go to door number 3.
I'm reminding myself to say something by hitting this button. So if I understand correctly, the final filtering was you selected active and inactive accounts. So those ones you feel really quite sure are credits that are not going to be used.
Right.
And then
we commonly call them zombie accounts.
Okay, perfect.
The old zombie account.
And then following that, with approval of this new part of the ordinance, I guess starting next year, you would look at accounts 5 years old and older and bring to us more accounts to be cleared? Or
we would provide the same filter. If anybody then was subject to the same filtering and showed up, we would do a notification to them. I'm not sure that we would bring it to your board because this ordinance change would be in place. They would have the ability to appeal. So they'd be notified and they'd have the ability to appeal to your board.
Oh, I see.
Yes, that's the way it's written currently.
So then, starting next year, you guys would filter your database at the 5-year point and then just retroactively notify those accounts that their credits are being eliminated. And then they have a chance to appeal or make a presentation.
Yes.
And secondly, I'd like to hear from anybody in the audience if they think 5 years is adequate in terms of setting that time frame.
Okay. With that as a segue, John? John supports credits. I've heard this before.
Yeah. John Matthews. I promise I won't filibuster for 35 minutes. There goes that.
The clock is ticking.
And it will be of no surprise that I've not been enamored of this
We're down to 29 minutes.
year and a half effort on credits. I've always thought that the credit issue is one that we could have spent our time a little bit better. I think Gerhard brings up a good point.
Thank you, John, for your enlightening comments. It was really...
Well, I get no respect. Not that I don't deserve any either.
John,
I understand.
There's no respect.
I understand. I appreciate that.
If you keep talking longer, we're going to have to get Rob up here. So
am I going to get a chance to talk?
Yeah, there you go.
First of all, I need to make one thing for the record. One of my GMs just had to leave, who's the GM of Channel Islands Beach Community Services District, and he wants to make sure that it's on the record that they have had wells that they did formally legally abandon. Part of that was part of a program with the Port Hueneme Water Agency, and they have an allocation, they generate credits, and those credits then go to the PHWA, which I think ultimately ends up with Callegas. So, Oxnard, is it Oxnard, Susan? Thanks. Wants to make sure that nothing in this ordinance would affect that. Those wells are, as I said, legally abandoned, not intended to be pumped right now, but actually the credits are part of an overall program that deals with the PHWA. But that leads me to a couple of other aspects of this. One is, I'm not speaking for a particular agency now, but for property owners that have property within the pumping trough pipeline area. If you recall, when that was set up, those individuals were told basically to take their wells out of production, either legally abandon them or not use them. But in my humble opinion, with the way things are going in the water community, there's going to be less surface water that we're going to have in the county. Now, hopefully I'll be wrong, but it just seems to me that with the things we have going on at United, with the with the Freeman diversion and whatnot, there may be less water that gets to places like the PTP pipeline. I think it'd be unfortunate if any of these people that are in the PTP voluntarily didn't pump their wells and just felt like, well, I don't have to report to the GMA because I'm getting my water from United. And then it turns out 3 years from now, United has to cut back the amount of water they send to these people. All of a sudden, these people have to start pumping their wells again. They're going to say, well, maybe I'll just pump my wells all the time, and they may be dry years where they have to use credits. Those credits will be wiped out by this ordinance, as I read it. It says the executive officer shall wipe these out. I think that
Same thing could happen in PV, where PV's gotten surface water from various sources over the years, where we have people who I know have wells. I wouldn't call them active wells. I'm sure they're not reporting on them, but those are backup wells that those people have if, in fact, at some point in time, Pleasant Valley is not able to deliver the water to them. I think Director Borchard brought up a good point of this. What is this 5 years? Is it every year you're going to bring back and knock some more off? Are you all prepared for 47 people coming in and appealing this? I mean, I would think that would be a nightmare for all of you. It says basically the executive officer will notify them of that, and then they have a right to appeal that. It would seem to me a better approach to this would be to take a year. I'm not in favor of this, as you know, but I'm trying to find common ground here. Why don't you take a year, notify people. If you have an inactive well, if you have a legally abandoned well or destroyed well, I think you're in a little bit different situation. But if you have an inactive well, or what some people might call an abandoned well, where you just haven't pumped it, give them a year or 6 months to say, well, wait a minute, I didn't mean to do that. I've been trying to do the right thing by taking surface water. In the case of the PT people, they were told they had to do that by contract, and say, hey, if you've got a reason why you don't want that well to be treated as if it never existed and all your credits are gone, tell us why. Have that go to the executive officer. But I think to say to the executive officer, hey, we're going to look at a 5-year period, and we don't care what happens. You're wiped out, but you can appeal it. You know, Gerhard said there's 47. Next year there may be another 20. You know, I have no people that if you do that to them, they're going to come in and appeal it. And we're going to be having a lot of appeals here in front of your board. To me, that just doesn't make much sense. It makes much more sense to phase this in, give people an opportunity to come in, let your staff know that, no, this is not intended to be an inactive well. No, it's not intended to be an abandoned well. And I intend to pump it at some point in time, and I expect those credits to be there. The other option that I was thinking about when I read this week is the tsunami of this credit issue would seem to be just that. Everybody was worried about a big number, 700,000 acre-feet. And I think by anybody's account, if everybody says, we're all cashing in our credits today, we're all out of business. I mean, really, we're in real deep trouble. But part of this was, well, that number is so big, is there a way we can whittle it down a little bit and make it look more manageable? Another way to do this is just take these, whatever the credit numbers are, whatever the filters that have been applied, and put those in some other category that is in Never Never Land, so that we don't look at it and get all sick and nervous that we have 700,000 acre-feet of credits. You're cutting it down by, what, 80? That would still make a lot of people sick and nervous. It doesn't make me sick and nervous. But just put them in a different category. Just put them over there and just say, these are credits we don't think are going to be used, and so don't get quite as nervous. Don't stay up all hours of the night, only stay up, part of the night. So that's my comments. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, hold on, John.
No, I just want, or maybe staff or John. Staff, the way I understand this is that you're looking at taking the credits away from abandoned or inactive wells, right? Not wells like you're saying that, for example, they're backup wells.
Okay.
Is that correct?
Just a clarification. It's an and. They have to be destroyed and inactive.
Yeah, but for example,
so it's an and, not an or.
The wells that are over that you're talking about are backup wells, and I don't think that's what the intent of it is. That
I'm sorry, I missed the question. Where I was going, credits go with the operator, right? That's the way we've always, and not necessarily the wells. So we may be getting off task a little bit here.
I think.
And the other thing on the credit issue, we're not afraid of the 700,000. That doesn't cause us to lose sleep at night. I'd like to characterize that the way staff's characterized it to your board on 2 or 3 occasions previously. The increase in use allowed by irrigation efficiency and the increase in use allowed by the use of credits have resulted in negating the 25% reductions. That's what we've shown. And that's really the concern. And what we're working on long term, and what the context of those conversations were. And it was your board's direction to look at this particular issue to just start chipping away at the credits issue.
But I thought I heard you say that the concern was that we're going to take away those backup wells.
No, not take away the backup wells, but there may be
or the
people-
credits from those wells.
If my understanding is that these would be only wells that are actually abandoned, sealed, there's concrete in them, I think the person has a problem there. But if these are wells that are still...
Yeah, I'll double check, and of course, we'll have, if we go to the second reading, we'll have this question confirmed. But my understanding is it's an and. It's an inactive account 5 years greater, and it's associated with an abandoned or destroyed.
That's what I thought.
Let me...
filter that I
Okay,
understand.
John.
Can I just comment on one thing on that? I want to respond to Mr. Pratt's comment. I got that from going to all these meetings. That's where I got this. One of the first, two of the first meetings I went to, there seemed to be this overwhelming phobia about the number of. That may not be your focus. I'm not saying it is, but at the meeting, that seemed to be like everybody was wringing their hands. Gee, we've got all these hundreds of thousands of credits. You know, my response and other people's response to some extent was, yeah, that's a good thing. You know, we're not using them, we're building them up. But some people said, you know, that's bad to have that many credits. So I wasn't focusing on that step. I was focusing on these series of meetings I'd gone to.
Let me ask. Go ahead. The county well, there is a county ordinance that says if a well is inactive for X period of time, it must be abandoned. That's a county ordinance. And what is that time frame?
I don't think, I'll have to check, but I don't think, if as long as you exercise it.
Well, that's not, okay.
That's
if you do not report usage on a county well for X period of time, I thought it was a couple of years or maybe 8 years. I don't know what the answer is. But there is a county well ordinance that says you can't just have wells sitting all over the place that aren't pumping water.
That is correct.
Okay.
It's 8
hours a year. So if a well is pumping, a well, if it's in compliance with the county, pumps 8 hours a year, and pumping 8 hours a year would require a report saying I'm active. I'm keeping it in a active status as a backup well. I pumped on an XYZ, and we've just exercised the well. If you do not pump the county a well, and you do not abandon it, destroy it, you're not in compliance with the county ordinance.
I don't disagree with that.
Okay, so so hold on, John. So,
but if there's a form you can check that says inactive, you can put a comment as a backup well.
Okay, so there are some methodologies in place that discriminate between wells that aren't being pumped but are being kept in a ready reserve status, are in compliance with the county ordinance, and therefore do not have to be abandoned. Did the filter screen those out?
What you mentioned in terms of having a backup well that perhaps is not being used, we'll have to double check.
Okay. All right. So we have that question. All right. Yes, ma'am.
We're not really talking about the filter. That was information they gave us. What we're talking about is this right here. The executive officer shall extinguish all accumulated conservation credits obtained by an operator with a destroyed or abandoned well of record who fails to submit extraction data for 5 consecutive years. So all that other stuff isn't part of this. This is all we're doing.
But the concern was the backup well.
All right. So what your proposal, John, is that rather than coming out with, maybe we ought to put into the ordinance that effective a year from now, any operator who has a abandoned well, who meets this paragraph and does not submit documentation that the well is in fact,
it has to be destroyed or abandoned and have no report.
Your comment was we ought to phase this in. I'm trying to figure out how to phase it in. The way to phase it in is to adopt an ordinance that says a year from now, the GMA will wipe out those credits unless you can demonstrate to us in a year that, in fact, you're entitled to those credits. That solves the Ocean View issue.
The Channel Islands.
Channel Islands, I'm sorry.
Under that criteria.
Yeah, I don't want to make more work for you because I think that's a lot. That may be a lot of work. That it's probably more work than what we're into. But it just seems it wouldn't surprise me that there's at least one person out there that doesn't know to keep their well active. Now, ignorance of the law is no excuse.
It doesn't say inactive. It doesn't say inactive here. It says it has to be destroyed or abandoned and not have a report for 5 years.
Abandoned. The person's not using the well. I mean, I don't want to get into if you want to make the argument abandoned. The person said, "I never abandoned it. What are you doing taking it?" I never abandoned it. It's sitting right there. I've got a.
My next question is: are you in compliance with the county?
Probably not. No.
Okay, so they have a different problem. We need to sick the county.
But it's not our job to enforce the county rules.
That's right.
Its own rules.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, if I might, Councilor Matthews is still here. Does this not present another example of us failing to research and notify prospective owners before we do an action? It seems to me this is a wonderful opportunity to put a registered letter out to everyone who we suspect has this well and ask them, are you abandoned or not?
Okay, my suggestion is... Hold on. Stop. Let's be fair here. Okay. At the last board meeting, there was an issue of credits. The task that was given to staff is come up with a policy dealing with abandoned wells or credits that are on the books that have no ownership to them. Staff has come back with their first cut at a recommendation. So I don't think it's fair to beat up on staff and saying, hey, you're off doing it willy-nilly. They've brought back exactly what we asked. We're doing exactly what we do, and that is we're debating it. So if the policy that they brought back is not acceptable, John's raised some issues, you've raised some issues about notification, then we don't pass the ordinance change, but let's not beat up on staff. Let's redirect them to make adjustments to what we want, or we just table the whole issue.
My only point is what we're discussing back and forth here is the definition of abandonment.
Well, I think the county has a county has an ordinance, and we ought to say in this, if your well is abandoned per the county ordinance, and essentially what's coming out of this is we need to send this back to staff and take another cut at it. Somehow tie it to the word abandonment. You've raised an issue for Channel Islands that they have some abandoned wells, and they've taken those credits, because they're still an operator, and moved them over to some other wells they have. That's a valid issue. That is an absolute valid issue. It's no different than Dan Nauman, with all the wells he operates, shutting down one well and moving the allocation over, or zone, or somebody else doing the exact same thing. So that's a valid issue. So that issue has to be dealt with. The issue of notification has to be dealt with. The issue of phasing in needs to be looked at. So really what I'm hearing is we need to direct it back to staff to take another cut at it.
Is there anybody else who has any other comments?
Unless anybody else has any other comments. I knew we'd get it there.
And
hold on before you,
Channel Islands credit account.
Okay, John wants to speak.
And the word, is it abandoned or is it backup? I think that's
the county doesn't. The county recognizes, I believe, the word abandoned. A well must be abandoned if it meets this criteria.
Right.
If you do not meet this criteria, you don't have to abandon it. So,
right. And if they are, then we file a non-compliance on it.
Rob Saperstein for City of Oxnard. I'll be very quick, but since we're going back to the cookbook, a couple other issues for staff to think about. First, correct the statement that was made. The PHWA, Channel Islands, Cayugas, Oxnard circle of allocation credits, use of water, only 700 acre-feet of credits goes to the City of Oxnard. The bulk of the credits that the Channel Islands district wells earn float back to PHWA and help balance their take of groundwater from United, of all places. So, yet to make it more complicated, that needs to be looked at carefully to make sure no unintended consequences. Oxnard is only a small piece of that puzzle. But Oxnard does have a couple other circumstances in which we're either going to bring some issues to the head with this policy, or maybe we can dance around them, because I think one of them actually should be done away with. So question for staff. The ag Tamonite transfers, when that occurs, typically the old ag well on the property gets abandoned. the allocation for those old abandoned wells should be extinguished and no credit should be earned once that transition of land occurs. I'm told that that may not have always happened. So some of these vampire, or whatever you call the credits that zombie credits, they're still wandering around on the books. Those ought to be the easy ones. So you in fact may be sending letters or trying to contact people that no longer exist in the world as
they're zombies, because credits are mindless little creatures. They're mindless.
They're gone.
Okay, listen.
So that's one example where those ought to be easy, and however we can get rid of those, let's get rid of those, because they should have been wiped off the books as soon as that transition occurred and the wells were formally abandoned. Yeah, but another example, River Park is one of a couple for the city of Oxnard, where we have an ongoing issue with the GMA. Prior to those wells being abandoned, those properties were commonly operated with the city of Oxnard. If you look at section 5.7.1, the last sentence says, credits may be transferred between commonly operated facilities. The GMA at the time, and it dates back to Lowell Preston, refused to transfer those credits between the commonly operated owners, the owners of it was Vulcan, I think, or Granite, that owned the property in the city of Oxnard. Before the wells were abandoned, while the properties were in transition, Oxnard and that prior owner were commonly operating those facilities. The GMA refused to transfer those credits. We've been on and off raising that issue with the GMA, and didn't want it to be a big thorn in anybody's butt, but this presses the issue. So there will be some, and those wells are now abandoned. To the extent they're abandoned and they're continuing to earn credits, city would say we're not entitled to those. There were credits on the books at the time the city took over ownership operation of those wells and that property. Those credits should have come to the city, and the GMA staff has refused to transfer those credits.
You lost.
Okay.
And you lost a credit.
No, they're just sitting out.
They're sitting there.
Still there.
They're sitting there. They're among the 70, 80,000 acre feet of
could be retired.
They're sitting there.
Anything else?
Those are.
All right. Let's. John's going to leave here in a second. I want to get to.
I'd just like to respond to that last question. Okay. I'm not aware of any request by the city that we refused River Park or a credit transfer.
Yeah. When I talked about the Port Hueneme Water Agency agreement that we've been working on with Channel, I mean, that's been taken care of.
Yeah, I think that I think what we've done is we've had a good discussion on this issue. John, I think, has made another excellent point. I don't want to lose it. If in the process of extinguishing credits we create massive amount of protests and work for the staff, it's a trade-off. And so you got to put your thinking cap on that I don't want to create this avalanche of appeals and the like, which just gobbles up a whole bunch of time. It may be a worthless exercise. But to the extent that a well has been abandoned by the county, the operator of record is no longer in existence, we can get those, we should get those off the books. If the better solution, as John suggested, is to put him in some zombie account, then maybe that's a solution. Then at the end of 10 years, if they're not claimed, they disappear. It's back to staff to take another cut at it. I think the cut you took at it was correct, and it created a lot of discussion.
Mr. Chairman, there's only 46 individual accounts listed, and so my thought is it doesn't take a lot of effort to contact 46 people by mail or post or whatever.
Well,
and that would put it to rest.
It takes a certain amount of effort. One, because we haven't heard from these folks. It's 5 years, 10 years.
They don't even know where they are.
We may not even have a record.
This is another good example why we should have, instead of automated meters, a man in the truck going around looking at things and find out where the hell it is.
Mike. That's another issue.
Mike, hold on. Zombies are going to take over this meeting if we're not careful. I'm watching the clock here, folks. Staff has got, it's back to staff, okay?
All right.
Enough on this issue. All right, the last item, I still don't see I'm looking around the room, Dr. Stiles, aging doctors, no, okay. All right, hey, let's go to, well, hold on here. Let me think through this for a second, because John's got to leave real quick and Charlotte here, so Gerhard, let me have you stop for a second. What's that?
Is there anything we need?
No, not on number 7. On number 8, let's talk about, if I may, let's talk about number 8 in the event that Dr. Stiles does not get here, because I think we need to deal with this issue, or at least start the process. And if Dr. Stiles get some sense of what you guys might want to do on this, okay? And if I may, there's a very good staff. We got it in this handout here. Here we go. Yes, we got. I assume the folks in the audience, we got a handout on the background. This issue of changing to the new format. This has been before this board for a long period of time. All of us have been working through this issue. It's not new to us. We're moving along the line of one of the issues that's been key to the M&I folks for a long time is the irrigation efficiency. We hired Dr. Stiles and his team to come in and do this analysis. They've done 2 workshops so far, and he is proposing changes to the ordinance that will reflect the irrigation index. My understanding is the 2 workshops went well, and approximately 30 people attended each item.
Yes.
The feedback I have gotten from a couple of growers and my brother, and when I get feedback from my brother, it's in my ear, so I will just tell you that. Anyway, the feedback I've gotten is that we may need some additional workshops, additional education, and the like. And I had suggested to Jeff shortly a while ago that maybe what we ought to do, and we might even be able to use it for Brian's group up in the Los Posos Basin, is maybe what we ought to do is create a series of online, what I call vignettes, maybe 5 minutes apiece, and take some of the slides that you guys use for your presentation and put them online with some narrative and some explanation, and put that on our web page so that growers can go online and see how to fill out the form, what's the rationale, how's it work. I'm not getting pushback from growers. I'm getting, hey, it's a new system, are we going to have time to learn it? And that was the feedback, some of the feedback I got from a variety of folks that I've heard information from. I know at Continental Airlines we do a lot of computer-based training, and the computer-based training tends to get very dry, and if the little vignette goes on more than 4.5 minutes, I fall asleep. It's very difficult for me to sit through that training, but it's required, and it works. And so I suggested to Jeff and to Brian, we might be able to do the same thing up in the Los Posos area to deal with the management plan, the objectives, and the like, so the people that are not at your meetings have a reference point to go to, and that becomes part of our outreach. Jeff had indicated that he knew of some folks that do this. I suggested you guys, staff, are able to produce a whole bunch of slide PowerPoint presentations, somehow to make that online with some narrative, and there's Dr. Stiles as I speak right now. So it may be that one of the ways we do this outreach is through some state-of-the-art, and that's the one thing I want to talk about before Dr. Stiles gets here.
Before we lose our 2 members, should we vote to call this a first reading?
Well, let's talk about that for a second. Dr. Stiles, I know you've been racing down from up north. We have 2 members that are about ready to leave, so I'm trying to figure out how we can deal with this issue.
I can stay a little longer, but we don't need all 5 of us to vote on a first reading.
Okay, so let's just do that.
Okay, then I'll go ahead and...
John, you got to leave.
Okay.
All right.
And thank you, and I want to apologize to Dr. I have to leave.
Okay. So what we'll do is we'll hear from Dr. Stiles. Keep in the back of your mind, if you would, this need for, I think, more outreach that we have done. I think we can do more. My proposal would be to come up with some online program, and I've asked Jeff to look into doing that and to come back to the board with some recommendations on how we might be able to put that together. Okay? So with that, Rick, if you'll go through your stuff to introduce Dr. Stiles or whatever you were going to make your presentation, let's do that, okay?
Sure.
And if we can get to some kind of resolution before 4 o'clock, before sharp.
4:15.
4:15, all right, we got a half hour, okay?
Well, in the interest of time, I'll go quickly. If I could have presentation number 8 up on the screen. Dr. Stiles is here. You asked me to introduce him, so I'm glad you made it down. While we're waiting for that to come up, for the record, Rick Viergoots, I'll be presenting item number 8 today, proposed ordinance 8.4, an ordinance to amend the FCGMA ordinance code, proposed resolution number 2011-0X, to incorporate the irrigation allowance index. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go through kind of quickly. If I'm going too fast, please tell me, and I'll slow down. So, Chair Mulhart, you introduced some of these issues, so I'll go quickly.
Next slide.
Okay, fair enough. Current system versus proposed. The current system allocates water based on a maximum water use. The proposed system allocates water based on demands for 3 levels of crop water use. Current system allocates water based on a max water use regardless of the number of crop rotations, and the proposed system considers crop rotations. Crop rotations are part of the allocation system. Current system uses 3 broad crop categories representing 7 crops, and my animation is dead. Here we go. And the proposed system uses 13 broad crop categories representing 25 crops. So we really increased the number of crops. And the formula is different too. The current system calculates the percent irrigation efficiency based on the allowed water divided by the applied water. This one turns it upside down. It calculates an irrigation allowance index by dividing the applied water by the irrigation allowance. It's not a direct calculation of irrigation efficiency. It does include water for salinity management, Santa Ana winds, uneven distribution uniformity, frost protection, and plant ET. Irrigation allowance index of 1 or less indicates the applied water is equal to or less than the allowance. So in December, your board told us to kick off option 1, make it, bring it forward, give us an approach to do it. You've given us your blessing with that. The approach includes workshops, changes to the ordinance code, which is why we're here today. We have contracted with ITRC again to do quality control for the first year. That brings us up till about August of next year. And reprogramming and relocating weather stations. As part of outreach, we use the Farm Bureau newsletter, agency semi-annual newsletters. We've got a link to the ITRC reports on the agency website. Also, since we've had the workshops, within the website we have the presentations from the workshops, frequently asked questions, those kinds of things. Postcards. We sent out 270 postcards, 1 to every agricultural operator regarding the upcoming workshops. And we've had 2 workshops. About 30 people were at each one. Good discussions at both workshops. And that's part of the process. We knew that would happen. And that's why we asked Dr. Stiles to come down and pick up information from the growers. During the workshops, Dr. Stiles was able to present the results of his study. We talked to the growers about crop types. Do we have enough? Are the water allowances reasonable? And Dr. Stiles fielded a number of technical questions about the program. From the GMA side, we talked about revised reporting, some brief training on how to fill out the new forms. We had screenshots of the new forms. We walked people through it. We had blank forms that people could fill out as we go along. We also described a January 1, 2012 start date for the program. So feedback, you've seen it in the staff report. Celery growers expressed concern. I know Dr. Stiles has worked with them. We've got other crops that weren't specifically covered, potted flowers, a hydroponic tomato facility, cover crops. Technical questions about how it takes into account salinity management and Santa Ana winds were discussed. Also, the year type is key to the new program. We'll be allocating water based on the year type, which is a function of precipitation over the calendar year. Who picks the year type? We've contracted with Dr. Stiles to help us hone in on the best way to do that, and that's what we've told the people in the workshops. The GMA will pick the year type. Another comment was we need more workshops, and Chair Mulhart, you mentioned that. Paperwork burden too high. Paperwork burden will change some. People will be asked to put more detail down about number of crop rotations and the percent crop cover of their crops. So that's different, and in that sense, it's additional work for people. Other feedback, some water values are higher and some are lower. People aren't sure how that will affect them. We're still working on this. Dr. Stiles and I have been in communication, exchanging emails, telephone calls. I also know he's been talking with Dr. Faber. So we've got some more work to do on these water allowance numbers. Another obvious question, does this supersede the 4 acre-foot cap in the Las Posas Basin? No, it's not intended to do that. What about surcharges? Well, the technical issue with that is that it's hard to say for certain, and the reason is that the new formula requires information that we don't currently collect in any level of detail. For instance, crop cover. 20% crop cover gets a certain water allowance. 50% gets a certain water allowance. 70%. Right now in the GMA, people don't report those to us, so unfortunately we cannot do a apples-to-apples comparison on that. Although Dr. Stiles has looked at that, we've asked him to look at that, and I'm sure he can speak to that today. But we do not have a way to compute it exactly. During the workshops, though, we did ask the growers, look at what you've been applying. With the new program, there's certainty. It has 3 levels of allocation, if you will, depending on the year type. We asked the growers to look at what they've been applying relative to the age of their crops. So there is certainty, and some of the growers will be able to do that comparison, whereas we won't have the data to do that. Ordinance code issue about surcharges. The current system prorates surcharges between 80 and 60% irrigation efficiency, and the full surcharge is due if it's less than 60% efficient. As you know, that's almost never triggered with irrigation efficiencies as high as they are in the agency. The current thinking is that irrigation... Yes?
Can I interrupt you? A question about that. If you back up one slide.
Sure.
Where you say that full surcharges occur with efficiencies less than 60%. That's when there is no historical or baseline allocation.
That's correct.
It's not just a uniform determination. It's actually if they don't have an allocation.
That's a good point you bring up, okay. And you are correct. If they were able to fall back on a historical and or a baseline, that would be taken into effect. Thank you. So the irrigation allowance index of 1 under the current proposal includes water per crop evapotranspiration, uneven distribution uniformity, salinity, and frost protection. It's not a specific measure of irrigation efficiency. It generally represents 80% irrigation efficiency by modern methods, but it's not an exact measure. In staff trying to determine if we could link the existing surcharge, tiered surcharge structure, the 80 and 60%, we did a comparison. If we followed the existing structure, there's roughly a 41% increase in water use between 80 and 60% efficiency. We could roll that into the irrigation allowance index and make a trigger of 1.41. Values greater than 1.41 would incur the surcharge for the full amount unless they didn't have another allocation. There's other ways to get at that number, though. One way is a little more simple. Divide 0.8 by 0.6. And Dr. Stiles and I have talked about this briefly, and right now we've got 2 possibilities to trigger that surcharge. We've left the 1.41 in the ordinance code just to keep us moving. We want to keep moving forward on this. key changes, we suggest the board remove reference to an overall 80% irrigation efficiency and replace it with an irrigation allowance index of 1 or less has been determined to be reasonable. Section 5.85 discusses the prorated surcharges, and again, we're recommending that between 1 and 1.4, the prorated surcharges are applied, and greater than 1.4, surcharges would be applied on the full amount if there wasn't another allocation system. You'll notice in my math, I'm striking that extra 1 on the end of 1.41. I don't think that's the way we want to move forward next time. We'll probably just leave it at 1.4 unless we decide a different number. There are other changes in the ordinance code that I didn't highlight in my presentation. They're highlighted in the staff report. They're also on items 8B and 8C. We're also recommending that a resolution be adopted to go with the ordinance code update. That would include the equation, some definitions, instructions. It would require percent crop cover be reported, number of crop rotations, and one of the things Dr. Stiles has stressed is we really need to be careful the way we estimate the irrigated acreage moving forward. And he has recommended, and I think it's a good suggestion, that recent aerial photos are used to better quantify the acreage and the percent crop cover. You have other options. For the first year, you could include a year-end evaluation of the program. You could choose not to apply surcharges for the first year. By the second year, operators must meet an irrigation allowance index of 1. You might consider it a different surcharge threshold, a pass-fail threshold, but for today, we're recommending the 1 and 1.4. And that is just about gets me to the end. For our conclusions and recommendations, we are recommending that you find ordinance number 8.4 to be categorically exempt under CEQA, section 15307 and 15308, conduct a first reading in title only, and schedule a notice public hearing at the next regularly scheduled board meeting on October 26th to consider adoption of ordinance code 8.4. So that is the conclusion of my presentation.
Okay. All right. Let me do it this way. We got 17 minutes. Any questions, Charlotte?
No, from me.
Any questions? We have a recommendation. My only comment is that, as I understand it, let's see if I can find it here. As I understand it, you're proposing, one of the proposals is through the first year. It says other options for consideration. One of the considerations would be through the first year we apply no surcharges.
That's one of the options.
Okay. If we don't adopt that option, when is the surcharge triggered? Above what point? 1.4?
It would the first surcharge would be triggered above 1.
1. So the way the current, if you adopt the ordinance the way it's written in here, without this other consideration, in the first 6 months, as they're learning the system, if they're above 1, it would trigger a surcharge.
Right, and that, of course, that would be due at the year end when they file their efficiency.
Okay. And a way to mitigate that is to either have no surcharges through the first year and call that a learning curve, or the other option would be maybe it may consider that a different surcharge threshold structure be incorporated, for example. Okay. So with regards to item number 2, option number 2, I personally do not agree with number 1. I don't think we're sending the right message if we adopt, well, let me back up. I don't believe we ought to have the full bore ordinance in the first 6 months, i.e. the first year, and have people go through a massive learning curve. I think we'd pack this boardroom with all kinds of people up in arms because of it's just a whole new system. What the heck are you doing? So that's leads me back to what I had said to Jeff earlier, that I think a series of 10 small little 5-minute videos online, how to fill out the form, how to understand it. All these training tools are part of the education process. So that's first requirement. Second requirement, I would not agree to adopting the ordinance where they are subject to a 1.0 threshold out of the chute. I think we're setting ourselves up for failure, and I don't want the system to fail. I think we're all going to go through a learning curve. Dr. Stiles is going to take us through a learning curve, and the feedback I got from some of the growers, sophisticated growers, was this is going to be a lot more complicated than you think it is because of the crop rotations. We do more crop rotations. I think their comment was, you even said at the meeting, that's unique in Ventura County because we just constantly are changing cropping patterns unless you're into a tree crop. So I would propose my solution. It's a proposal. You guys can yay or nay it, but my proposal would be in the first 6 months, the limit to the index would be, I originally said 1.3. I could go as high as 1.4. In the second 6 months, that'd be the tail end of 2012, the index limit goes to 1.2. Then the first 6 months of 13, it's now 1.0. So we phase it in. We give ourselves a learning curve. We reflect the fact that people have to go through a learning exercise, some phase-in process, and as I say that, Steve gets up to shoot me down. Steve, are you going to talk? No. Okay. You're going to sit over there. Anyway, that's my proposal. My proposal is, as it's written and adopted, out of the chute, 1.0, I think we're buying ourselves a load of problems. I think and having no limit through the first year, to me, is unacceptable. Now, I don't think anybody's going to run out and just pour water on the ground for the fun of pouring water on the ground. But if we don't have some upper limit, I'm not sure people are going to get serious about paying attention that it is a new system. So I want to get some pressure so that they pay attention, learn the process, phase our way into it, and not pack this boardroom with all kinds of protests and screaming constituents. So that's the numbers I've come up with. What are your thoughts? David, you're a pumper. Let's start with you.
Just at the top of just thinking about what you said, I like the idea that your phase-in process, but I'm concerned that using different numbers over a series of months might in itself be confusing and kind of convoluted. If in fact we're saying here that 1.0 is 80% efficiency, and that's the ultimate place we want to be.
No, we're not saying 80%. We're saying, 1.1 is the answer.
1.0 is 80%, is what I read here.
Yeah.
And if that's the place we want the program to be, then why not keep the program as it's intended to be and waive penalties in that first year period, but provide a notice that understand the way the ordinance is set up, you have exceeded your allocation, and when the program is fully implemented, you will be due surcharges. Suggest you look at your system, look at your water use, and determine if you're filling out your paperwork properly, et cetera, et cetera. In that case, the program stays the same. It's learned one time. And then growers have a year to implement any other changes that might be necessary to try and get within that realm.
My suggestion then would be is set it at 1.0, add a statement in there that surcharges as a result of being less than 1.2 will be waived, but above 1.2 or 1.3 or 1.4, whatever the number is. But there has to be some upper limit on the process. So you say then the answer is 1.0. We'll waive the surcharges if you come in above 1.0 and less than 1.4. But and then
for a certain period of time.
For a certain period of time. I think that the phase-in, if you spell it out, it's in the ordinance. You produce a vignette that I proposed online, and you tell people, go look at how we're implementing it. Then we have an argument that says it's a phased-in process, folks. It's not a drop-dead date. Anyway.
If I could ask Dr. Stiles a question.
Dr. Stiles, you're going to have to come up because I got to get you on the record here.
When you and your folks go out and check efficiencies in the field, are you typically seeing operations at lower efficiencies than 60%?
I think the best way to answer that is to show you a slide that I was showing the growers in my grower meetings.
Okay.
Is that possible? Can I load that?
If you can get to it, yeah.
Can you load that from there? The short answer is 1.4 is very, very, very on the high end. I mean, there was very few growers that would, based on the data that we looked at, with limited knowledge on the applications, because there's limited information that's provided on the application. But based on that information, there's very few growers that are over that 1.4 category.
How about 1.3?
I have to look at the graph. I mean, we just pull it up and look at it. I can tell you right now that what generated the most questions was this graph. We plotted our guesstimate of what the growers' applications of how they would fall with the program using 3 years of data, using a wet year, dry year, and an average year, so everybody can kind of see. And actually, to be honest, right now, what generated more questions were the guys that were below a certain value as opposed to above a certain value. As you're aware, our critique of this program at the very beginning is that you were showing that you had 700% efficiency on some of your crops. And it looks like you're generating water when you say your efficiency is greater than 100%. That was the main criticism of the program. But the inverse of that is that if you have a 700% efficiency and you just basically use the same numbers, the ratio is going to come out to a really low value of like 0.1 or 0.11. And so we actually generated a lot of discussion about why some of your growers are below 0.2. Is it because our numbers are too high? Or is it because there's some other problem?
Their acreage is wrong or whatever.
Acreage could be wrong, like the APN acreage could have been used as opposed to the irrigated acreage. Young trees, we've identified young trees from the get-go here. That was the main thing that we thought was causing the problem. But young trees versus old trees is usually only off by a factor of 2, and if you have a ratio of 0.1, you just multiply that times 2. It doesn't come out to a reasonable value. So we still are looking at some low-end numbers, and we have our field work that we did to do this study, but further work is needed to try to answer the low-end ones, I think, just as important as maybe a few of the high ones. If we can look at it,
She's upstairs in the booth loading it right now.
Very few that are on the high side. I would estimate only like maybe less than a dozen are in that category, and maybe even less than 5. Or I don't remember exactly the number at 1.4. But 1.3, 1.2, 1.0 probably only represents about 5% of the applications that were submitted. There's only a small chunk of the total during the 3 years of analysis. So that's your grower's 3 times 3. So it's the same grower, 3 times. So if he's in the high category, he tended to stay in the high category, right? It was based on the 3 years analysis that we were able to show you.
What percent efficiency would you say would be would demonstrate cutting-edge technology being used in the field, proper pressure compensation, all the bells and whistles?
80 is a target value. 80 is a very reasonable target value that we use when we do scheduling, when we talk to growers, when we set up the starting value. For districts that are trying to move one step further, we use 85%. No one goes up to 90. It's extremely difficult to make that huge leap from the 80s to the 90.
So you've never seen 90, and 85 is...
Well, we've seen 90 in a lot of places. We've seen 95s, but that's like on a field-by-field basis where they've switched to drip irrigation, where they have the high levels of management. We have seen it, just not on a large-scale basis like a water district's basis. I guess I'll just wave my arms and imagine a scatter diagram out there, and the range is from about 1.4 down to 0.1, and we have a lot more data that was generating questions by the growers of the people that were below 0.5. Some of the discussion was, why would anybody be below 0.5? Are your numbers wrong? Why would anybody be below 0.3? And so those are good, hard questions, and we've been kind of trying to search for the answers since the last grower meeting, and I haven't come up with any good conclusions. We found a few, smoking guns out there, like the data entry on the application was incorrect, like the incorrect volume of water applied. So a couple of those. We found some acreages that didn't look right, and then we found quite a few examples of the cover. The cover is, we plugged in the full cover number, the 70% cover number, and it looked very obviously that it was 2-year-old or 3-year-old trees. The cover number was 20%. It should have been a much smaller value. But again, it didn't make the ratios go up to 1.9.
I guess the question that's before us right now, or one of the things I'm learning is we're going to go through a learning curve within the agency, within the growers, as we transition to this new protocol. And if we adopt the ordinance as it's currently written, then anybody that's over 1.0 is going to pay surcharges. And surcharges, I think right now are running $1,100, $1,200 an acre foot. Big chunk of change. So one of the proposals, one of staff proposals is that we eliminate all surcharges for the first year. I'm not totally comfortable with that because I think that's pendulum too far. Dave, on the other hand, I am sensing doesn't agree with that. So if we set the upper limit at 1.x, what should x be so that we can go through this learning curve? Does it take a full year to do the learning curve, or are they 2 6-month increments so we can start ratcheting people down to get where they're supposed to be? And with that, Mike's got a question. So
it's actually more. My question is more for you, Mr. Chairman, rather than Dr. Stiles. Somewhere along in the discussion, I thought I remembered that we were possibly going to have people who fail the new one and hold them to the 1.0. But if they failed that, we would take, for the first year, take them back to the old method. And if they still failed, they paid the penalty. Because in learning how to use a new, you should hold them to a tight number, as Director Borcher's saying, to make them darn well learn when they're not doing it right. But then the penalty could kick in if they failed both methods. Then they pay. Because if they're going to fail, they're going to fail it last year too, probably. And we would already know probably before we ever start who's going to fail it.
Well, I guess my question to you then, Dr. Stiles, would be, how difficult is this learning curve implementation going to be? What is your sense, having listened to some of the growers and some of the concerns? Is it more complicated?
One of the comments that I received was that, are we going to wait till the end of 2012 and find out we have a surcharge? And I said, well, you can apply the data because you've done the application. You can go in and see right now where you fit on the crop. So the old system was very simple, but that was what the problem was. It was very simplified, right? So they can take their 3 years applications, and we actually did it for them, and then go in and see what the numbers are. And I'm going to agree with you, is that the people that were over 1.0 were over all 3 years. And the people that were down at 0.3 were at 0.3 all 3 years. So there wasn't a lot of differences for one grower between the years, and they can see where they are right now. So I think, some of the loudest comments we were getting were people actually could see where they were. They were above the line, for example, I didn't get any harsh comments from the avocado growers. And so I suspect the avocado number is probably too high.
They didn't squeak enough, huh?
Because the celery guys were all at the meeting, and they spoke up quite a bit. And I really had to look hard at the numbers and their feedback, and we went back to the drawing board on the fall celery number, and we had it in there at 12 inches. And we had to do some serious work. I need to justify if we're going to change one of the numbers on here. And so we did some backup on it, and we modified the numbering between the first grower meeting and the second grower meeting, because I got some excellent feedback from the celery guys for the fall celery crop. Now, we didn't change any other ones. We didn't change any other celery crop, the multiple rotation of celery. And I talked to a couple of growers about what they would do for celery, because they don't always do celery, or something like that. So we were trying to figure out how those numbers made sense. But we did make one change, because if you look at the scale, some of the celery growers were off above 1.0, and I think a couple may be in that 1.3, 1.4 range.
All right, well, let me go back to the question. The question is, how do you guys, folks, want to implement this? The way it's drafted is, it's full bore 1.0, it's on. Staff's making a recommendation to give a period of waiver. I've made a recommendation to do it in phases. Your comment was we can do it full bore on and give a little caveat. If you're over, we'll recalculate it under the old system, and if you're under, that's a first year gratis. If you're over, you would have paid penalties under the old system. So no harm, no foul. You knew that's what the rules were, but at the end of this first year, the whole system is in place. Which way do you guys want to go?
Well, I agree with David's comments that if we go changing the numbers, people are going to get really mixed up. Okay. I think having 3 different phases and then being there is too much. I think that's too confusing, especially when each phase is only 6 months. People won't know where they are. Other than that, I think that some kind of a relaxation of the penalty initially would be appropriate, but I agree with you that you can't do away with the penalties completely. There might be people out there who already are going way over and already paying, and they need to realize that this new system isn't a buy on that.
Okay.
You know, if I can interrupt you just a minute, Charlotte, that was the point I was trying to talk to Dr. Stiles about. That percent efficiency number really is kind of critical in terms of determining that level. And he's indicated that in rare cases do we see growers at the 60% level or worse. Obviously, the closer you are to 100%, the better system you have, the more precise and efficient your water application is. But I'm concerned about if our base number is 80%, and we have a majority of growers out there, for whatever variety of reasons, are not at that number. We've kicked a whole bunch of people perhaps into the surcharge mode, and that, certainly it's not something I could support. I guess I'd like to hear more information about, what exactly that what you found out with your surveys about, so we can come to a decision that seems to be reasonable and fair.
I have a very small PDF version that we used as a handout, so some of your growers have this. It's on your website, and I apologize I don't have it up on the screen, but I can answer your question about the 1.4 versus 1.2 now. So nobody was above 1.4. No one was above the 1.4 number. And there's only less than 5 that are above 1.2 right now in the existing format that we have the program. So 1.0, my feeling right now is 1.0 isn't a punitive thing that's going to just affect a large group of your growers. There's a handful of growers that will affect right off the get-go here. But 1.2 isn't going to affect anyone. 1.4 won't affect anyone, is my opinion. There's not that many data points above that point, given the data that we evaluated on the existing applications. And I'll put an asterisk on that those applications don't have all the information that we needed to do a full-on comparison yet, right? We just made some assumptions about what the values were, what the crops were, and if we didn't know, we used the higher number. In other words, we gave them more water than what they should have had if we didn't know. So if I didn't know if it was a young crop or not, I would have used the full allocation number.
So your sampling then was from past applications?
3 years of applications, and they matched up with wet, dry, and typical. And there was a good point here made is this isn't set up to do a 6-month analysis. This is all being done on a January to December analysis. We don't really have it set up that way. We don't have any numbers set up on a 6-month number. Does that make sense? We did everything, and all of our analysis is only January to December, and we can discuss if that's good versus doing a water year.
But they have to report at the 6-month point. How do they know if they're...
They can report their water use numbers and what their cropping patterns were, but we don't have our water use numbers in a 6-month.
Okay. And only at the year point they reconcile it to see if they were efficient.
I didn't break it in June. We didn't do anything to break it. We could in the future, but the way it's set up right now, we didn't do it 6 months.
Doesn't do us any good.
It'd be pretty difficult with the variability of weather and I mean, you can call something a wet year and get all your rain in March. I mean,
and that came up a lot with the growers. Is the way we do it is we're doing January through December, and that doesn't reflect the way growers think of water years. The water year is usually July to June. That's how most people do the water year, the rainfall year. And so that isn't how the program is set up. And so since there's so many annual crops, it's, you know, it's a half dozen one ways.
It may be that we'll have to change our reporting time frame. I'm not opposed to doing that if it matches the reality of the situation.
I think we'd look at it, you would need to look at a couple of years and see how much of an impact it would make. But I'm not seeing that it would make a huge, you know, it doesn't drive the number. When you have a wet year, you don't all of a sudden, it doesn't change all the numbers dramatically, you know, in the shifts of the numbers. If you look at the total shifts of the numbers, it's only like 1 inch or 2 inches of water between the wet years and the, you know, the average. It doesn't make a huge shift just because it rained 23 inches, because a lot of that water isn't available to the plants. You know, a lot of that water just goes past the root zone. It affects the ET, it affects the amount of water they apply, but it doesn't make a huge difference in this allocation number here.
Let me interrupt for just a second. John, do you want to say something? Hold on.
John Dickinson, United Water. I was just going to say one way you could approach this is take the recommendation of staff, but then phase in the amount of penalty. So you start off with maybe a 20% of the surcharge value, 40%, so forth, in the different reporting periods. So you can still use the 1.0 and the criteria that have been developed scientifically, but lessen the penalties during the burn-in period.
Okay.
Just one point for consideration. Since I've been here, I'm not aware of anyone who has failed the irrigation efficiency application. I don't think that number is big. If it is, just something for you to consider.
Okay. All right. Let me, Dave, any more questions, or Mike? What do you guys want to do?
Let me ask Dr. Stiles while he's thinking. This has come up a lot where we're trying to chart water consumption versus the rainfall historical. Not uncommonly, you know, you'll have a wet spring and a dry fall in the same calendar year, but not the same rain year. Your work would be easier and more accurate if it was a June-July anniversary rather than January?
I don't think it would affect the accuracy so much. It's just shifting it to the way everyone thinks about precipitation year. So right now I might be calling something a wet year that someone else is going to say, well, that wasn't a wet year, you know, because of the way the, you know, of the water year versus the calendar year evaluation.
Well, your statement is really correct, because I mean, the lemon season is November 1st to October 31st. Right. And that's how we think of the rain year.
Right.
And the problem we were having was standing water in wells. You know, if you use the calendar year, you've had a wet spring and a dry fall, and so it doesn't correlate. But if you switch it to a June to July year, then you can correlate the rainfall better with the standing water in the well. And so then you have, because if it was a dry fall, a dry spring, that made up a dry year, and you could see the water level in the well be down. Yeah. But otherwise it confuses it, because you have a year with very low water, very low precipitation, but the wells stayed full for some reason. That was because they had a wetter other half.
We have it in monthly. We have it in the monthly format. The table that is up there right now for the allocation and the wet, dry, average year analysis, and the way it was directed to us to put this together was to stick to the calendar year, because that's what you guys were using. But I'm agreeing that to get it so people agree with us when we say it out loud that it was a wet year, it would be more logical to use the July to June time frame, because a wet year would be a wet year then. I mean, everybody would agree that was, and then it's not the year, it's the, you know, 2010, 2011, and then everybody gets confused when you do that, because the federal guys use October and the state guys use July. Okay. So it doesn't totally straighten it out, but it makes it a little closer to what everyone talks about. But then you always end up with 2 years being used as the analysis instead of 1 year. And that's the reason I liked it at the beginning, is we just say 2009. We just say 2010, and then everybody knows it's the calendar year. And we talked about this at the very beginning, and we were kind of directed, you know what, let's just keep it the way you guys have been doing it for 20 years. And so we kept it on the calendar.
Right. But that's where we had trouble harvesting the data, because it was done that way for the past year. So you go back to 20 years and try to chart it, it's a pain in the neck.
Okay. Let me see if I can, again, see if we can move this down the road here. We have two options, I believe, that are now before us. Adopt the ordinance as it reads, which sets the limit at 1.0, no phase-in.
I think we're in a first reading, aren't we, Chair?
What's that?
Aren't we in a
first reading?
Yeah.
But we have to adopt something that's written in the first reading. So if we have an option to phase in or not phase in, and Dr. Stiles is essentially telling us, and staff has told us, that they've never had somebody go over the limit as a result of efficiency, and it's a very small percentage that would be over the 1. And we're going to go through a learning curve. The penalties aren't paid for a year. So option 1 is to read the ordinance in title only, as it's written, no phase-in. The other option is to read the ordinance in title only with an added paragraph that has some kind of phase-in methodology to be determined. Or the other option is to read the ordinance in title only, think about a phase-in, and if we have to do that at the second reading, put that phase-in at that point in time, it gives us a chance to think about it, or some language that would talk about a phase-in if it's really necessary. So those are, I guess, are now the three options. Phase-in, no phase-in. You can put the phase-in now, or we could put the phase-in at the second reading if we determine we want to go that route. What would you guys like to do?
It's pretty difficult for us, as 3 board members sitting here, to determine what that phase-in is at this point and
I would agree.
Put it in. So it seems like we should probably put it off to the next reading.
So your suggestion then, your issue would be...
Ask staff to come back
all right, well, let me back up. Do you think we should have a phase-in?
Yes.
Okay, Mike, do you think we should have a phase-in?
Absolutely.
And I think we should have a phase-in. I don't know what that language is. So, are you guys prepared to adopt Ordinance 8.4 by reading title only as a first reading?
Yes.
No. Because it doesn't include the phase-in language.
No.
It would have
We do the phase-in at the second reading.
Okay.
Because we have to adopt it.
I thought what you asked us was, would we support first reading with a phase-in to be determined later?
Oh, okay. If I said that, then that's an option.
I thought you said...
Are you okay with that?
I'm okay with that. I did have one small comment.
Can we legally do that, actually adopt an ordinance in title only, knowing full well we're going to change it and adding words to it? Does that pass the legal test?
Well, there's no requirement for a first reading, so all you're doing is signaling your intent to adopt an ordinance at your next meeting. That ordinance in its final form is subject to amendment by motion of any board member.
At the second reading?
At the second reading.
Oh, okay. So we could adopt this ordinance and telegraph to folks that we're going to put in a phase-in methodology to be determined at the next meeting. That's a fair statement?
Yes.
You okay with that?
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, we're okay with that. How about you folks in the audience, in Waterland out there? Dave, you've been nodding your head up and down the whole time. You okay with that process? Sam? Sam goes, I don't know.
Somebody said they wanted the zombie phase.
I want the zombie phase-in, right? Okay.
Another small issue that I just would ask to be included in the next version.
I'm going to get Rob up here if I have to fight for him. Yes, sir.
On page 2, is it 2? Bottom of page 2, where we're talking about what the calculation of irrigation efficiency is. It's the very bottom of 5.6.1.2.4. And the sentence at the very bottom says, ER is the effective rainfall measured in inches as determined by the executive officer. Well, it's not really just the executive officer's sole opinion. It's based on the rain gauge information that the GMA collects, correct?
Yes, definitely.
It's not Jeff's opinion of what rainfall was. It was... Right.
All right.
So that should be tightened up in my mind.
Yeah, you should determined by as certified by the executive officer utilizing the appropriate equipment. I don't know. Okay? All All right. Anything else? All right. Can I have a motion?
I move to direct staff to come back with a revised ordinance with a...
No. You got to adopt ordinance number 8.4 in title only, with the caveat that there will be a phase-in verbiage added to the final ordinance.
Okay, what he said.
Okay. That's your motion?
I second that motion.
Okay. Let's have a roll call, please. Oh, well, that's a motion. So hold on. You gotta pass this motion, and Mike gave a second, right?
Yes.
Motion a second.
Chair Mulhart?
Yes.
Director Kelly?
Yes.
Director Borchard?
Yes.
Okay. And you have to read in title only.
Ordinance number 8.4, an ordinance to amend the Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency Ordinance Code relating to annual efficiency extraction allocations.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Dr. Stiles. We'll get there at some point. All right.
I really appreciate his statements, though, with regard to this calendar year versus the wet year, because in our meetings, I think Brian would endorse that we've been all over because people are trying to analyze the well records versus the year, and if we had been for the last 20 years doing it June, July, it would have been a whole bunch simpler, in my opinion, and we could more correctly correlate, because otherwise the issue is, how effective is the basins being recharged, and are we overdrafting, and you get a smoothing effect where you take a half a year plus a half a year.
Yeah, I will add another comment that one of the growers made during the presentations, was that the possibility about splitting this into a 6-month analysis. That's what I wanted to kind of go that direction for a second, because you kind of mentioned that we've always used this as a 1-year analysis, and that's usually how we do crop water evaluation. But it's so diversified down here with the full-time crops and the way the strawberry is done. Everything's so different that it seems like it wouldn't be that much of a stretch to make it into a 6-month analysis, and then you get rid of that whole problem. So the first half of the water year is one condition, and that affects a certain number of growers, the fall celery guys. And then the last half is a different type of water year and a different type of growers that it would affect. And that you set this up in 2 blocks, and the forms are already actually set up like that they do it as a 6-month. You report as a 6-month number, and so that the water year idea is a good idea. But I thought that idea was even better, because if you split it into 2 6-month time frames, it's already kind of set up that way. It wouldn't be that hard to make the tables based on first 6 months of the year from the calendar year perspective, and then the second. You just do it as a 6-month analysis instead of a 12-month. The only problem with that is then you have 2 reporting time frames. This ratio could be, it could be off based on the time of the year and other problems associated with that.
Yeah,
my comment by a grower.
Yeah, my suggestion is that that's a discussion you ought to have with water experts out there and make a recommendation. I personally like the 6-month reporting period. That's what we've been doing historically. If it works and makes the system better, I would move in that direction, and we can work our way towards that. Okay, thank you, Dr. Stout. Let me go to the last item. It's a budget issue. I'm watching the clock. People are tired. Can we do this in 15 minutes or less?
Absolutely.
Okay, let's have at it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the board. For the record, Gerard Kapusik with the Watershed Protection District and agency staff. If I could ask the gentleman up in the booth to advance to the presentation or item number 10. I do not have a PowerPoint today. I have 3 simple slides that will hopefully set the groundwork. And I was so impressed with my colleague, Mr. Bondi's presentation that, I'll try to be FB not for Facebook, but for fiscal bounding. While his was visual, animated, and aggressive, I'll try to be numeric, sequential, and conservative. So you have before you, and if I could ask the clerk of the board, the copies, if they can be placed on the counter here or passed out. Brian, perhaps you could just pass those out so everyone has the same information. As your board knows, every year in budget session, we provide you with a retrospective look back. We provide you with a recommended budget based on your constant board policy guidance. And then for the 4 years beyond the next year budget, we do a 5-year projection, which is exactly that, just a projection. And so the starting point of the presentation today really is just to update that based on the 10-11 year end that you just approved in terms of a receipt and file at the item number 2. And with that respect, as you can see, what it appears then is our starting point for 11-12 budget that was adopted is a fund balance, starting year fund balance, which has 2 components. Approximately $500,000 that is going to be sequestered for the GEMS fund based on your board's policy guidance in the budget adoption last year, and about $1.7 million, just shy of $1.8 million, available for this year and subsequent years' funding. And this is the first column on the left of the first page, essentially just updating the 11-12 budget with the closing actual year-end 10-11 figures. And you can see that approximately $2.6 million will be available for funding 11-12 expenses. And it is projected and it included in the adopted budget approximately $1.3 million of expenses, with the 3 largest components being the PWAC charge estimate of just shy of $550,000, the first cycle of the GSAP grant payments that you approved, approximately $334,000 of that $500,000 is scheduled for expenditure in 11-12 based on the agreements and the timelines of completion, and a standard $100,000 operating contingency with the other expenditures identified below. So if in fact the 11-12 budget materializes as shown, it is expected at June 30th of 2012 there would be approximately a $1.2 million year-end fund balance, which would then start as the starting year balance. And then you see it runs out through the remaining 5 fiscal years. Now, each of these columns, 12, 13, 13, 14, 14, 15, as you get to each budget year, you'll adjust that. And these are just subject to the assumptions and the projections that are made at this point in time. But if, in fact, over this next 5 years, 11, 12, current year, and the 4 years that are projected, the revenues are collected as identified, the expenditures are no more than identified, with no more than $100,000 of contingency being used in any given year, then at the end of that 5-year period, June 30th of 2016, the agency would work its way down through the settlement revenue expenditures to a starting year fund balance for the next 5 years of just under $100,000 or $93,000. Now, as your board knows and as your board has directed, the roughly $1.5 million in settlement revenue has been used for one-time expenditures. Approximately 70%, or $7 out of every 10 of the $1.5 million in settlement dollars, were used for the following 3 major components: $500,000 GSAP grants, $285,000 to restore the GEMS fund up to its $500,000 balance for potential litigation use, and excuse me, an investment of $250,000 in the 2012 GMP update, primarily payments to United for the groundwater model and update. So again, about 70% of that settlement revenue is earmarked for those 3 projects. The remainder has been earmarked as identified in the projections here, but over time, the end of 5 years, the settlement revenue will be worked through. So what happens then at the end of 15, 16, and beyond? The second slide, if the donor could advance to page 2. The second slide attempts to bound the future in terms of 3 distinct assumptions for beyond 15, 16. Scenario A, for lack of a better term, might be viewed as very bare-bones conservative, and it's anchored in saying that all we're going to be able to apply the pump charge revenue is the 100,000 acre-foot safe yield target. So that is very conservative in terms of what's available in revenue, and no change to the $4 per acre-foot. No large-scale surcharge projection. Historically, the non-settlement revenue surcharges average somewhere between 35 to 50 a year. This is conservative, 25, and a very conservative interest projection. Scenario B, let me go down to the expenditures. On scenario A, the expenditures returns to a core PWAC cost of $450,000, which has been the average PWAC cost over the last 5 years. It identifies no continuation of the joint technical study position with MOU, with United, a bare bones legal fee, which has been also the average, very minimal consultant contracts, and very minimal all other expenses. It does, however, include the $100,000 operating contingencies at that point. Scenario B is a slightly medium-term or medium intensity projection. It assumes that the self-reported extractions will average about 120,000 acre-feet, which is a figure that's equal to 98% of the managed term extractions between 91 and 2010. It does, however, assume a dollar increase to the per acre-foot, continues with conservative projections on surcharge and interest, and it returns in terms of expenditures to the core PWAC costs over the last 3 years, and slightly escalated costs for the remaining expenditures shown below. Scenario C is the more robust, optimistic, larger scale version. It assumes that the extractions reported will be 130,000 acre-feet, and that's a figure that's equivalent to 98% of the extractions reported over the almost the entire life of the GMA from 85 to 2010. It does show a $6 an acre-foot to the maximum amount allowable under statute. Continues a conservative surcharge and interest. On the cost side, it projects a PWAC figure that's equivalent to the cost that's identified in the current year budget, 11-12. It shows continuation of full funding for JTSP MOU at an escalated amount at that point. Legal fees at the current year, $65,000, which is a combination of internal and external. $50,000 in consultant contracts and roughly other expenditures, but again preserves $100,000. So in effect, we're trying to bound some assumptions. There's nothing magic about this. You can mix and match as you wish, but for purposes of analysis, that's the initial boundary we did. So if you'll advance to the third slide, what will be the effect of applying these assumptions in terms of the three models? As you can see, under scenario A, this is not a fiscally sustainable model because the total amount of pump charge revenues would not be sufficient to meet even the bare bones PWAC charges of itself. And so there would be a deficit situation structurally in that budget identified under that scenario. Scenario B has a similar but lesser deficit. Scenario C is a sustainable model if those assumptions came to pass and your board decides that these are the combination of core costs. Now, the good news here is that there's time to adjust, and this is driven by your board and the decisions you make as to the level of core costs, the work plan effort, and commensurately on the revenue sides. But you asked us to come back with a long-term projection to start the discussion, start the thinking, and that's what we've tried to do today. You have various opportunities, future board meetings, and our mid-year budget report for this year in preparation of the following year budgets to make the mid-course corrections. But I believe we have been responsive to your direction at least up to this point. So I conclude at that point, answer any questions.
Any questions for Gerard? Any comments, questions? Okay, anybody in the audience? Gerard, I'm going to tell you a secret. There's nobody in the room right now. It's just us.
Well, I've been told I've had that effect.
No, no, I'm lying. They're all out there waving at me. The only comment I'll make is I think, as you said, you can take the scenarios and run them all over the place. If you go to page 3, I think the acre-foot projection is the one that really, it's interesting. We're probably at the 120,000 acre-feet, and Dr. Steve and Brian and you folks and everybody's telling us we ought to be closer to the 100,000 acre-feet to be sustainable. So if you actually take the projected groundwater extractions and flip them, put the 130 in scenario A and the 100,000 over in scenario C, it's not a pretty picture even at that. I mean, yeah, we quote-unquote break even maybe. It's probably still not enough in the first year, A, but in the last year we really fall off the cliff. And we had said for a long time that our goal is not to collect penalty fees. Our goal is compliance, and because of some enforcement action that we've done over time, we have in fact collected some fairly significant penalty fees. If the LPUG does what I envision they want to do and they get to where they want to be, that area will be in balance, and the fees won't belong to us, they'll belong to them, and they'll use it for projects and all those kinds of things. Maybe not necessarily the penalty fees, but the cost of that structure, and hopefully it'll bring them in balance. If we can take that model and duplicate it in on the Oxnard Plain and bring that area into balance and loop all the things together. So the idea that penalty fees will help make the shortfall is actually an objective we want to see disappear. And the scenarios that you've given here indicate, assuming the assumptions are valid, is that we're going to have to make some serious consideration of funding the GMA. And I've always felt that although folks do not want a bureaucracy, and I understand that, I think when you look at the work that's being done up in your area and the amount of money and cooperation that's going to take place in your area, there needs to be a strong umbrella organization that you folks have a right to run to say the rules aren't being applied fairly or the rules aren't being enforced or whatever the issue is, and not have to run to the court of law, because I think that's astronomically expensive. So my vision long term would be is that we have a strong GMA to act as an umbrella over the rules that we put in place for LPUG and ultimately, hopefully, the rules we put in place for the Oxnard Plain. It gives Oxnard the security they need, Camarillo the security they need, the growers the security they need, and there needs to be a strong GMA to do that. And I think at some point in time, we're either going to have to take a serious look at our budgeting, our costs, and or our funding process, because what staff has done is they've looked out to the future, and based on these assumptions, it's not sustainable. And I don't think there's anything we'll do today, but we need to raise the awareness flag, and that's really what it boils down to. So, anybody in the audience?
Let me make a quick comment too, just to add to what you said. We've kind of embarked in a I want to say maybe a 5-year program of kind of getting the GMA house in order. And a source group was hired recently to go track down some of the delinquent reporters, and database has been configured to do a lot of we spent a lot of money on a lot of I think worthy projects. This irrigation efficiency project, which is going to roll out a better program, and so there was a lot of additional cost that we accepted was going to occur, and we knew that we had a lot of surcharge and penalty money coming in to cover that. One would anticipate, I think, that as we've begun to wrap up all of these housekeeping issues, that we will probably be able to see PWAC charges come back down to maybe not levels where they were 5 years ago, but certainly down to more levels consistent with the kind of effort that will be required in the future. So I agree with you that we will have to analyze expenditures, and I would assert that we need to continue to try and have a lean and mean organization that provides the umbrella, the structure for enforcement and for ultimate enforcement of the boundaries, but at the same time is not just creating a greater and greater organization that perhaps doesn't serve its stakeholders very well.
Carol, do you have something you want to say?
I'll be quick. Carol Schoen, Zone Water. The only thing that I would call attention to and maybe want to understand when we do a budgeting process is how many years have we actually used $100,000 in contingency? Because if you're spreading that out over the next 5 years, I mean, there's $500,000. If that wasn't used or only used partially in little increments through the past years, you'd have an extra $500,000 at the end of the day when you're looking at this. So maybe every year when we budget 100,000, maybe only 10 of it was transferred out, or, I'd like to know what the history of that 100,000 is. Every year we put it in the budget. When you're projecting that makes a big difference in 5 years' time. So that would just be my comment when we actually start looking at stuff.
Doesn't that carry forward as a residual surplus and becomes the contingency for the following year?
It looks to me like
we're actually
it
spending.
does in the actual budget, but in the projections it doesn't.
The answer to Carol's question is found on page 8 of item 2, the year-end report. Over the last 6 years, we have used anywhere from as little as $6,400 to $183,000 in 1 year where we had a high contingency. So it just depends on the policy decisions that your board makes.
I think for me, this is 5 years. This is looking the crystal ball in 5 years. Who knows what anything's going to be in 5 years? For me, as I sit up here and think through this, the bigger issue is, do I want a sustainable GMA? Is the GMA going to be an integral part of giving stability to whatever basin management plans are put in place to make sure that the management plans we put in place don't fall apart? And for me, my answer is yes, and therefore we have to make sure we fund it correctly. Does that mean that we'll accept everything that is thrown in front of us? The answer is no. Does it mean that we have a right as a group to sit down and be very frugal with our money? The answer is yes. Do I want to build a giant organization? The answer is no, at least for me. And I don't think the staff is not clamoring for a giant organization. The board's not clamoring. I want to make sure that when these management plans are put in place, that there is an organization that has the wherewithal to make sure it's protected, and that's what I think the growers and everybody else wants. So I think there's a lot of assumptions here that will have to eventually be changed, and we'll look to everybody's guidance to do that process. And the only other thing I would say to Dave's comment about hopefully we'll be able to drive the cost down. I think I've been here almost 25 years. My goal 25 years ago was to solve all the problems so I could leave. Guess what? It hasn't happened. Every year the problems are still there and they get more complex. And I think this program, this irrigation index program we're going to place, I think it's actually a more complex program, but I think it answers the questions that need to be answered. And I think that's the thing that drives us more than anything else, is it just gets more complicated. It is what it is. So, anybody have any other comments? We could sit here for another 9 minutes and go to 5 o'clock straight up, or Rob, it's your call. Do you want us just to stop? Yeah, you had enough pain? Meeting's adjourned. Hey, congratulations. When is the big D date? Oh, what was item 11? We'll consent to it.